Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we explore a quiet truth that rests at the heart of our deepest anxieties, the endless chase for happiness. We often believe that peace lies just beyond the next achievement, the next possession, or the next desire. We run tirelessly, our breath short and our minds clouded, only to find that the finish line keeps moving. This constant pursuit, this deep and restless wanting, is a shadow that follows us. But what if happiness is not something to be caught? What if it is the gentle stillness that arrives when we finally stop running? Tonight's journey is about letting go. It is about discovering the profound peace that finds us when we cease our chase and simply allow ourselves to be. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Shadow of Wanting. There is a shadow that walks with us, a quiet companion born not of the sun, but from a space within. It is the shadow of wanting. It is not a dark or menacing presence, but a subtle, persistent emptiness, a hollow ache for something just out of reach. It whispers to us in moments of stillness, reminding us of what we do not have, of who we are not yet. It is the hunger for more, a thirst that deepens with every sip. In the ancient teachings, this feeling is sometimes given a form, a name. It is called the hungry ghost, a being with a throat as narrow as a needle and a stomach as vast as a cavern. No matter how much it consumes, it can never be full. Its hunger is a fire that feeds on itself, and its greatest suffering is that the very thing it craves, satisfaction, is the one thing it can never find. This is the shadow that followed a man named Kale, though he never knew its name. He only knew its weight. Kale lived in a city of winding streets and bustling markets, a place where the air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of 1,000 conversations. He was a merchant, and in his youth his ambition was a clean, bright flame. He had grown up with little, and his first and only desire was to build a life of comfort and security for his family. He worked with a tireless spirit, his hands skilled and his mind sharp. He learned the rhythms of the trade winds, the languages of distant lands, and the delicate art of turning a small investment into a larger one. His first success was a modest one, a single cart of fine silk that he sold for a small profit. He brought the coins home, their weight cool and solid in his palm, and felt a deep, simple joy. He had done it. He had provided. That night, he slept a dreamless, peaceful sleep. But the nature of wanting is to grow. The single cart of silk became 2, then 10, then a fleet of ships with sails as white as clouds against the blue sky. The small home he had built for his wife and children was replaced by a sprawling house with courtyards and lily ponds. The simple meals of his youth gave way to elaborate feasts with dishes from every corner of the known world. By every measure the world could offer, Kale was a man who had everything. Yet, the quiet, dreamless sleep of his youth never returned. Instead, his nights were filled with a restless energy, a mind that spun with numbers and contracts, with risks and opportunities. He would lie awake, the fine silk sheets cool against his skin, and feel a familiar, gnawing emptiness in the pit of his stomach. The hunger was still there, only now it was larger, more demanding. The shadow of wanting had grown with his fortune. When he walked through the city, he no longer saw the vibrant life around him. He saw only reflections of his own status. He saw the finer robes of a rival merchant and felt a sting of envy. He saw a plot of land with a better view than his own and began to calculate its cost. The world was no longer a place to be experienced, but a ledger of things to be acquired. His joy was no longer found in the having, but in the getting. And the moment something was his, the thrill would vanish, replaced instantly by the sight of the next, more distant prize. He was climbing a mountain whose peak was always shrouded in mist, and with every step upward, the air grew thinner and the world below more distant. His wife, A woman with a gentle heart and eyes that held the wisdom of the changing seasons, would watch him. She saw the lines of worry etch themselves deeper around his eyes. She saw how he would hold his son, but his gaze would be 1,000 miles away, lost in the currents of trade. One evening, she brought him a simple cup of tea as he sat hunched over his ledgers. The steam rose in a soft curl, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the leaves. "You work so hard, my love," she said, her voice a quiet melody. "Come, sit with us in the garden. The moon is full tonight." Cale barely looked up. "I cannot," he said, his voice clipped. "This new shipment from the south requires all my attention. There is a great deal at stake." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a touch he once would have leaned into. Now he flinched, as if her stillness was an interruption to his frantic pace. "But what is at stake, Cale?" she asked softly. "What more could we possibly need?" He looked at her then, but his eyes did not truly see her. They saw a question he could not answer, a stillness he could not comprehend. "You do not understand the pressures I am under," he said, turning back to his papers. The space between them grew quiet and vast. The tea grew cold, its fragrance fading into the night. Cale believed that his anxiety was the price of success. He told himself that this constant, churning worry was the engine that drove him forward. He did not see it as a sickness, but as a sign of his importance. The more he had to lose, the more he had to worry. And so, the worry itself became a strange kind of wealth. He mistook the weight of his burdens for the substance of his life. He was like a man carrying a sack of heavy stones, believing the strain in his shoulders was proof of his strength. He never thought to simply put the sack down. His inner world began to resemble the hungry ghost of the old tales. His spirit had a mouth that was always open, a throat too constricted to ever let nourishment pass through. He consumed experiences, possessions, and praise, but none of it ever reached the vast, aching emptiness inside. He hosted the most lavish parties in the city, filling his home with music, laughter, and the most influential people. He would stand in the center of it all, a gracious host with a smile fixed on his face, and feel a profound and terrifying loneliness. He was a ghost at his own feast. He watched people enjoy the food he provided, the wine he poured, the comfort he had built, but he could not taste any of it himself. The flavors turned to ash in his mouth. One year, after a particularly daring and successful venture, Cale became the undisputed master of commerce in the region. His wealth surpassed that of lords and princes. To celebrate, he commissioned the construction of a new wing for his house, a grand hall with ceilings so high they seemed to touch the heavens, and walls adorned with paintings by the finest artists. The night it was completed, he held a banquet that would be spoken of for generations. Everyone of importance was there. The air hummed with praise for him. People toasted his name, celebrated his genius, and admired his power. Cale moved through the crowd, accepting their compliments, his smile never wavering. He had reached the summit. There was no one left to surpass. This, he thought, must be happiness. This must be the feeling of being full. But as the night wore on, a cold dread began to creep into his heart. He stood by a massive window, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. He held a golden goblet filled with the rarest wine. He had everything he had ever chased, and yet the hunger was there, sharper and more painful than ever before. It was a terrifying realization. If this was not enough, what would be? The mountain had no peak. The chase was endless. The music and laughter of the party faded into a dull roar, the sounds of a world he was no longer part of. He saw his reflection in the dark glass of the window, a man in fine robes, holding a golden cup, with the eyes of a stranger, hollow and lost. The face was a mask of success, but behind it there was nothing, just a vast, echoing emptiness. He slipped away from the celebration, unnoticed. The sounds of his own triumph faded behind him as he walked through the silent corridors of his enormous house. He felt like an intruder in his own life. He found his way to a small, forgotten courtyard at the back of the estate. It was a simple place, one he had not visited in years. A gnarled old plum tree stood in the center, its branches dark against the night sky. A stone bench sat beneath it, covered in a soft blanket of moss. He sank onto the bench, the cold stone a shock against his warm skin. The air here was cool and still. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze. He looked up through the branches of the tree and saw the moon. It was not full, but a perfect, slender crescent, a silver sliver hanging in an ocean of darkness. It asked for nothing. It strove for nothing. It was simply there, luminous and serene. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Cale was not thinking about tomorrow's profits or yesterday's accounts. He was not calculating or planning or worrying. He was just sitting, just breathing. The frantic energy that had propelled him for years began to subside, leaving behind a profound and aching exhaustion. He felt the true weight of his life, not the weight of his wealth, but the weight of his wanting. It was a crushing burden. He thought of his wife's question from so long ago. What more could we possibly need? At the time, it had sounded like foolishness to him, the words of someone who did not understand the world. Now, in the silence of the courtyard, it sounded like the only wisdom he had ever heard. What was he chasing? He had been running for so long that he had forgotten why he started. The initial, pure desire to provide for his family had become a monstrous, insatiable beast, and he had become its servant. He had spent his life feeding a hunger that could not be filled, sacrificing his peace, his love, and his very self to a shadow. A single plum blossom, a late bloomer from the old tree, detached itself from a branch and drifted down, landing softly in his open palm. It was a small, perfect thing, its petals a pale, almost translucent white. He looked at it, this tiny, fragile piece of beauty that had asked for nothing from the world and had been given freely. It held more substance, more reality than all the gold in his vaults. He closed his hand around it gently. He did not feel happy, he did not feel peaceful. He felt, for the first time, the true and devastating depth of his own poverty. It was not a poverty of coins or possessions, but a poverty of the spirit. The party inside was still raging, a monument to a life he now realized he had never truly lived. The sound reached him as a distant, meaningless hum. He sat there for a long time, the cold of the stones seeping into his bones, the single blossom held loosely in his hand. The shadow of wanting was still with him, but something had shifted. Before, he had been running from it, trying to outrun it by accumulating more and more, hoping to fill the emptiness it cast. Now, for the first time, he was sitting still with it. He was looking at it. He was not trying to defeat it or satisfy it. He was simply acknowledging its presence. The journey to find peace, he was beginning to understand, was not a journey outward to acquire more. It was a journey inward, to understand the nature of the hunger itself. The problem was not the empty cup of his life, but his frantic, desperate attempt to fill it from a poisoned well. The first step, perhaps, was not to find something to pour into it. The first step was to simply stop, to sit with the emptiness, to feel its contours, to understand its nature without judgment and without fear. As the first light of dawn began to grey the eastern sky, Cale was still sitting on the stone bench. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been in his life, but it was a different kind of tiredness. It was not the frantic exhaustion of the chase, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue that comes after a long fever has broken. The shadow was still there, a faint outline in the growing light, but it no longer drove him. He was no longer running. He was just a man, sitting under a tree, holding a single flower, breathing the cool morning air. And in that simple, profound stillness, a question began to form in his mind. Not a question of commerce or of gain, but a question of being. Why am I so empty? The question held no immediate answer, but in the asking of it, a small, quiet space began to open within him, a space where something other than wanting might one day grow. The question hung in the quiet air, not demanding a reply, but gently dissolving the armor he had worn for so long. He did not try to answer it. He simply let it be, a seed planted in the barren soil of his soul. The sky softened from indigo to a pale, luminous grey. The sharp edges of the world began to reappear, first the dark silhouette of the plum tree, then the texture of the moss on the stone bench, then the intricate veins on the blossom in his hand. A single bird, then another, began to sing, their notes clear and pure in the stillness. These were sounds he had not truly heard in decades. They had always been there, a constant backdrop to his life. But his mind had been too full of noise to register their music. Now, they were the only sounds that mattered. He thought of his son, now a young man with a quiet seriousness that mirrored Cale's own ambition. But he remembered a time when his son was a small boy, with hands that were always sticky from sweets and a mind full of endless questions. One afternoon, the boy had run to him in his study, holding a fallen leaf that was a brilliant tapestry of red and gold. "Father, look!" the boy had whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. "The tree is painting." Cale had been in the middle of a difficult negotiation, his mind a battlefield of numbers and clauses. He had glanced at the leaf, dismissed it with a nod and said, "Yes, it is very nice. Now run along, I am busy." The light in his son's eyes had dimmed. The boy had quietly placed the leaf on the corner of the desk and slipped away. Cale had swept it into the wastebasket later that day, without a second thought. Now the memory returned with a physical ache, a tightness in his chest that was sharper than any business loss he had ever suffered. He had been so busy chasing the horizon that he had failed to see the universe of wonder offered to him in a small, outstretched hand. He had been trading gold for dust. A soft footstep on the gravel path made him look up. It was his wife, Elara. She was wrapped in a simple woolen shawl against the morning chill, her hair woven in a loose braid. She did not look surprised to find him there. Her eyes, which held the calm depth of a forest pool, simply met his. There was no judgment in her gaze, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, unwavering presence. She did not speak, did not ask him what was wrong. She simply came and sat beside him on the cold stone bench, pulling a part of her shawl over his shoulders. The warmth of the wool and the simple, profound warmth of her nearness was more comforting than anything he had ever known. They sat in silence together, watching the sun's first rays touch the highest branches of the plum tree, turning the leaves to gold. In her silence, he felt a permission he had never given himself, the permission to be broken, to be lost, to simply be without striving. After a long while, he stirred. His limbs were stiff, and the exhaustion was a deep, settled thing within him. He opened his hand and looked at the plum blossom, now slightly wilted from the heat of his palm. He stood, and Elara stood with him. Together, they walked back towards the house. They entered through a side door into the grand hall where the party had been. The scene was one of quiet devastation. Half-empty goblets lay on their sides, their contents staining the fine tablecloths. Plates of exotic food, barely touched, were growing cold. The air, which had been thick with perfume and spice, now smelled stale and sour. The beautiful tapestries and paintings seemed garish in the pale morning light. Yesterday, this room had been the pinnacle of his achievement, a testament to his power. Now, it looked like a tomb, a monument to a colossal waste of spirit. He saw not wealth, but decay. He saw not success, but a profound and hollow sorrow. He walked through the wreckage of his own celebration, his hand held gently in his wife's, and for the first time, he did not look for something to acquire. He was looking for a way home, even though he was already standing in his own house. The question in his mind had changed. It was no longer, "Why am I so empty?" but a quieter, more hopeful whisper, "What is real?" Part 2. The Weight of the Empty Cup. The question, "What is real?" did not bring Kale peace. It brought a quiet, gnawing chaos. The solid ground upon which he had built his entire life had turned to mist, and he was adrift. He stopped going to his counting houses. He let the ships sail without his anxious supervision. He would sit for hours in the mossy courtyard, but the stillness he had found on that first morning now eluded him. His mind, deprived of its usual diet of commerce and calculation, had turned on itself. It was a relentless engine, now fueled by a new kind of wanting, the wanting of an answer. He dissected his past, weighing every decision, every ambition, every failure. He tried to reason his way to tranquility, to construct a logical framework for peace, as if it were a trade agreement. But every thought led only to another question, every memory to another regret. He was a man dying of thirst, while trapped in a room made of ice. The solution was all around him, but he did not know how to drink it. His anxiety was a different color now. It was no longer the sharp, hot anxiety of gain and loss, but the cold, heavy anxiety of a man who has lost his own map. He was full. His mind was a cup brimming with the bitter brew of his own life, with theories about his own emptiness, with frantic ideas about how to achieve stillness. He was so full of the concept of peace that there was no room for peace itself. He felt the immense weight of his own mind, a burden heavier than all the gold he had ever owned. He was exhausted by the ceaseless internal monologue, the voice that analyzed and judged and demanded. He was a scholar of his own sorrow, and the more he studied it, the more profound his ignorance seemed. It was during this time that he began to hear whispers. Travelers and merchants, speaking in hushed tones in the marketplace, spoke of an old man who lived high in the mountains that loomed over the city. They did not call him a teacher or a master. They simply called him the old man of the mountain. They said he did nothing remarkable. He tended a small garden of herbs, gathered firewood, and watched the clouds. But those who made the difficult journey to his remote hut and sat with him for a time came back changed. They did not return with grand pronouncements or new doctrines. They returned with a quietness in their eyes, a lightness in their step. They seemed to have left a great weight behind them on the mountain path. Kale, in his desperation, seized upon this idea. His old instincts, the instincts of a merchant, took over. This wisdom, this peace, was a commodity. The old man was its keeper, and Kale would go and acquire it. He would pay for it, not with gold, but with the sincerity of his suffering. He prepared for the journey with the same meticulous planning he would have used for a new trade route. He packed provisions, hired guides, and studied maps. He rehearsed the questions he would ask, the long and eloquent speech he would give to convey the depth of his despair and the brilliance of his mind. He would lay out the entire problem of his life before the old man, and the old man, in his wisdom, would provide the solution. He would return to the city with the answer, the final, most valuable acquisition of his life. He was setting out to capture enlightenment. The journey began at the city gates, where the familiar noise and smells of his life still clung to him. But as the path began to climb, the world began to change. The paved roads gave way to dirt tracks, the manicured gardens to wild forests. The air grew thin and clean, scented with pine and damp earth. For the first few days, Kale's mind remained a fortress of his own making. He walked, but he did not feel the ground beneath his feet. He was busy in his head, refining his questions, worrying about the outcome of his quest. He was a ghost, walking through a landscape he could not see. But the mountain was a patient teacher. The relentless physicality of the climb began to wear away at his thoughts. His muscles ached. His breath grew short. The concerns of his mind, his legacy, his emptiness, his search for meaning, began to seem absurdly abstract in the face of the simple, immediate reality of placing one foot in front of the other. He had to pay attention to the loose stones on the path, to the sudden shifts in the weather, to the growing thirst in his throat. The mountain demanded his presence in a way his life never had. It slowly, gently, began to empty him. The weight of his thoughts was replaced by the simple, honest weight of his own body. The complexity of his anxieties was replaced by the simplicity of his needs: water, rest, a safe place to sleep. He let his guides go after a week, choosing to continue the last part of the journey alone. He walked for days through a silence so profound that he could hear the beating of his own heart. He drank from cold mountain streams and ate the simple food he carried. One evening, sitting by a small fire, he watched the stars appear in the vast, dark sky. They were not the distant, muted stars he saw from his city courtyard. They were a brilliant, blazing river of light, so close he felt he could reach out and touch them. And in that moment, for the first time, his mind fell completely silent. There were no questions, no answers, no Kale the merchant, no Kale the seeker. There was only the watching, the warmth of the fire, and the immense, silent presence of the night. It was a fleeting moment, but it was the first taste of a different kind of fullness, the fullness of being empty. He finally found the hut, tucked away on a small ledge just below a snowy peak. It was a simple structure of wood and stone, so perfectly a part of the landscape that he almost missed it. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney. An old man was outside, methodically chopping wood. He was smaller than Kale had imagined, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles, his movements slow and deliberate, yet full of a quiet, fluid strength. He did not seem surprised to see Kale. He simply paused, his axe resting on a log, and nodded a greeting. Kale, his carefully rehearsed speeches forgotten, stumbled forward. All the anxiety and desperation he had carried up the mountain came pouring out of him in a torrent of words. He spoke of his wealth, his success, his houses, his ships. He spoke of the grand banquet and the hollow emptiness he felt in there, midst of his own triumph. He spoke of his sleepless nights, his restless mind, his profound spiritual poverty. He spoke of his journey, his hopes, his desperate need for an answer. He paced back and forth in front of the small hut, his voice echoing in the mountain stillness. He was filling the quiet air with the noise of his life, piling up the facts of his suffering like a monument. The old man listened. He did not interrupt. His gaze was calm and steady, like the surface of a deep lake. He listened until Kale had exhausted himself, until his words dwindled into a choked silence. Kale stood before him, panting, vulnerable, his entire life laid bare. He waited for the old man to speak, to offer some profound insight, some piece of wisdom that would make sense of it all. The old man simply smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. He gestured towards the open door of his hut. "You have come a long way," he said, his voice quiet and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves. "You must be thirsty. Come, let us have some tea." Kale was taken aback. Tea? He had just poured out the entire contents of his soul, and the answer was tea? But he was too weary to argue. He followed the old man into the hut. The inside was even simpler than the outside. There was a small hearth with a crackling fire, a sleeping mat, a few clay pots, and a low wooden table. There was nothing else. Yet the small space felt complete, lacking nothing. It was a room that breathed. The old man moved with an unhurried grace. He filled a small iron kettle with water from a bucket and placed it over the fire. He took 2 simple, handleless cups from a shelf and a small wooden box of tea leaves. Every movement was precise, attentive, and whole. There was no wasted motion, no sense of hurry. The simple act of preparing tea became a silent teaching, a demonstration of a way of being that was utterly foreign to Kale. Kale sat, his hands clenched in his lap, his mind already beginning to spin again. What did this mean? Was it a test? A metaphor? He was trying to understand, to analyze the situation, to find the hidden meaning. The water began to sing softly in the kettle. The old man spooned some dark, twisted leaves into a small pot and poured the hot water over them. A rich, earthy fragrance filled the small room, a scent of damp soil and mountain air. The old man then picked up one of the cups and placed it in front of Kale. He lifted the teapot and began to pour. The dark, amber liquid filled the cup, rising steadily to the brim. Kale watched, ready to receive it. But the old man did not stop. He kept pouring. The tea reached the very lip of the cup, hesitated for a moment, and then began to spill over the edge. It ran down the side of the cup, forming a dark pool on the wooden table. It dripped from the edge of the table onto the packed earth floor, and still the old man continued to pour, his expression calm and serene, his hand perfectly steady. Kale watched in stunned silence, at first confused. Then, as the tea continued to pour and the puddle on the floor grew larger, his anxiety returned in a rush. This was wasteful. This was wrong. It made no sense. Finally, he could bear it no longer. "Stop!" he cried out, his voice sharp in the quiet room. "It is full. The cup is full. It can hold no more." The old man stopped pouring. He set the teapot down gently. He looked at Kale, his eyes clear and deep. And then he spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of the mountain itself. "Like this cup," he said, gesturing to the overflowing vessel, "you are full. You are full of your own ideas, your own questions, your own suffering. You come to me seeking wisdom, but your cup is already overflowing. How can I show you anything new? How can you receive anything unless you first empty your cup?" The words struck Kale with the force of a physical blow. In that instant, the world stopped. The frantic spinning of his mind ceased. He looked at the overflowing cup, the wasted tea, and he saw himself. He saw the utter futility of his quest. He had come here to add one more thing, the answer, to a life that was already suffocating under the weight of its own contents. He had never once considered that the path was not about adding, but about taking away. He understood. The weight he had been carrying was not the weight of his emptiness, but the weight of his fullness. His mind, stuffed with ambitions, regrets, knowledge, and the relentless pursuit of more, had no space for the simple reality of the present moment. The peace he sought was not a distant treasure to be found, but a space to be cleared. He sat in silence for a long time, the old man's words echoing not in his ears, but in the very core of his being. The anxiety that had been his constant companion for years began to recede, not because it was answered, but because the mind that created it had finally fallen still. He looked at the old man, who was now calmly wiping up the spilled tea with a cloth, his movements as mindful and unhurried as before. There was no judgment, no expectation. Kale slowly reached out and picked up the wet, empty cup. He held it in his hands. It was light. He turned it over and let the last few drops fall to the floor. He then placed it, empty and waiting, back on the table. He looked at the old man and bowed his head, a gesture not of defeat, but of profound gratitude and release. He had not received an answer. He had received something far more valuable, an empty space. And in that quiet, humble emptiness, the journey could truly begin. He stayed with the old man for many days, though he could not have said how many. Time itself seemed to flow differently on the mountain, measured not by the turning of a merchant's ledger, but by the slow passage of sun and shadow across the floor of the hut. Kale did not ask any more questions. The urge to fill the silence with the noise of his own seeking had vanished, replaced by a simple, profound curiosity. He learned to listen. He listened to the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees, a sound that was at once a roar and a whisper. He listened to the crackle of the fire in the hearth, each pop and hiss a small event in the universe of the room. He listened to the silence itself, discovering that it was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a vast and gentle holding space for everything else. He began to help the old man with his daily tasks. They were simple, repetitive, and deeply grounding. He learned to chop wood, not with the frantic energy of a man trying to finish a job, but with the focused attention of a man who is only chopping wood. He learned to feel the weight of the axe in his hands, the satisfying thud as the blade bit into the log, the clean scent of the split pine. He learned to fetch water from the spring, feeling the cold shock of the mountain stream on his hands, the growing weight of the buckets on the walk back to the hut. He learned to tend the small herb garden, his fingers in the cool, dark earth, carefully pulling the weeds from around the tender shoots of mint and thyme. Each task was a lesson in emptying the cup. When he was chopping wood, there was no room for thoughts of his past life, his wealth, or his anxieties. There was only the axe, the wood, and the rhythm of the movement. When he was weeding the garden, there was only the feel of the soil and the distinction between the weed and the herb. His mind, which had been a raging sea of abstract thought, was becoming a calm, clear pool, reflecting only what was right in front of it. He was not trying to be mindful or present, he simply was. The doing of the task, when done with complete attention, was a meditation that cleansed him from the inside out. One afternoon, the old man was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. Cale sat nearby, mending a tear in his cloak, his stitches clumsy but earnest. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic, abrasive whisper of stone on stone as the old man worked. Cale found himself mesmerized by the process. The old man's hands were gnarled and ancient, yet they moved with a dancer's precision. He was not crushing the herbs, he seemed to be persuading them to release their essence. Finally, the old man paused and looked at Cale, his eyes twinkling. "Your mind is quieter now," he said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. Cale nodded. He did not need to say anything. The quiet was a shared space between them. "The mind is like this stone bowl," the old man continued, tapping the mortar with his finger. "For years, you have been grinding worries and ambitions in it. You have ground them so hard and for so long that the dust of them has filled every pore of the stone. You thought you were empty, but you were actually full of this fine, bitter dust. You could not see it, but you felt its weight. You tasted its bitterness in everything." He picked up a clean cloth and carefully, meticulously, wiped the inside of the mortar. He blew into it, and a tiny cloud of green dust puffed into the air, carrying the sharp scent of the herbs. "The work of a lifetime," the old man said softly, "is not to fill the bowl. It is to keep it clean. A clean bowl can hold anything. It can hold bitter herbs or sweet water. It can hold sorrow, or it can hold joy. It receives all things, but is stained by none of them. The secret is not to chase after the sweet water. The secret is to simply keep the bowl clean." Cale looked at the empty mortar, its smooth stone surface now clean and waiting. He understood. Happiness was not something to be added, like a rare ingredient. It was the natural state of the clean bowl. The anxiety, the wanting, the endless chasing, these were the bitter dust that coated the surface, preventing him from tasting the simple, pure water of life itself. The work was not acquisition, it was purification. It was the gentle, patient, daily act of wiping the bowl clean. When the time came for him to leave, there was no formal farewell. One morning, The old man simply handed him a small cloth bag containing some dried herbs and a loaf of hard bread. "The path down is easier," he said, and that was all. Kale bowed deeply, a gesture of gratitude that came from a place beyond words. The old man simply nodded and turned back to his woodpile. As Kale began the descent, he did not feel he was leaving a teacher behind. He felt he was carrying the mountain and its silence within him. The cup was not full. It was not empty. It was just a cup, ready for whatever the world might pour into it. Part 3. The Echo in the Valley. Kale's journey down the mountain was a descent into a world that was both the same and entirely new. The city was as loud and bustling as he had left it, but he no longer felt its frantic pulse as his own. He moved through it with a quietness that had been born in the high, thin air. He had learned the first part of a profound lesson, the need to empty the cup. But the habit of a lifetime, the instinct to seek, does not vanish in a single moment of insight. It is a deep and winding river that has carved its way through the landscape of the soul. Though he had stopped chasing wealth and status, the seeking energy remained, and it began to look for a new object. He had stopped chasing the world's approval, but now a more subtle chase began. The chase for his own approval, for the validation of his newfound path. This is a quieter, more treacherous form of wanting, for it masquerades as wisdom. It is the story of the echo in the valley. There was once a young man named Ren who lived in a village nestled at the foot of a great mountain range. Ren was a musician. He played a simple wooden flute, and the music he made was not for fame or for coin, but for the sheer joy of it. He played for himself, for the morning mist that clung to the fields, for the old woman who sorted rice on her porch, for the children who chased dragonflies by the stream. His music was a conversation with the world around him, a gentle breath that gave voice to the beauty he saw. His happiness was a simple, self-contained thing, like a smooth stone warmed by the sun. It needed nothing from the outside to complete it. One day, while wandering farther than usual, he discovered a hidden valley. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a perfect bowl carved from the heart of the mountains. Towering cliffs of grey stone rose on all sides, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. A waterfall cascaded down one side, its sound a constant, gentle roar that was the valley's heartbeat. The floor of the valley was a carpet of soft green moss and wildflowers he had never seen before. Ren felt as if he had stepped into a sacred space, a temple built by the earth itself. He sat on a moss-covered boulder, took out his flute, and began to play. He played a simple melody, a tune that spoke of his awe at the beauty surrounding him. The notes, clear and pure, floated out into the vast, silent space. When he finished the phrase, he paused to take a breath. And then he heard it. From the cliffs opposite him, the melody returned, perfectly clear, a ghostly and beautiful repetition of his own music. It was an echo, but it was unlike any he had ever heard. It was not a faint, distorted copy. It was a perfect reflection, as if the valley itself was singing his song back to him. A thrill shot through him, a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy. He laughed aloud, and the valley laughed with him. He played again, a more complex and joyful tune, and the valley played it back, its stone walls acting as the most perfect audience he could ever imagine. He felt seen. He felt heard. His music, which had always been a private joy, was now being affirmed, amplified, and celebrated by the world itself. He spent the entire day in the valley, playing until his lips were sore and the sun began to dip below the western cliffs. As he walked home in the twilight, his heart was full. He had found a magical place. He had found a friend in the stone and the air. He returned the next day, and the next. The valley became his sanctuary, his private concert hall. But slowly, subtly, something began to change. At first he had played for the joy of playing, and the echo was a delightful surprise. Now he began to play for the joy of the echo. His focus shifted from the music he was making to the music he was receiving. He was no longer in a conversation with the valley, he was in a conversation with himself. He began to experiment, seeking the best possible echo. He would move from one spot to another, testing the acoustics. He would play a note and then listen intently, his head cocked, judging the quality of the reflection. Was it as clear as yesterday? Was it as strong? His music began to change as well. It was no longer a simple, heartfelt expression of the moment. It became a performance. He composed intricate melodies designed to show off the echo's clarity, rapid cascades of notes that would sound impressive when they came rushing back to him. He was no longer playing for the flowers or the waterfall. He was playing for the approval of the cliffs. The simple, self-contained joy he once felt was being replaced by a restless, anxious need. The valley was no longer a place of peace, but a place of judgment. And the judge was the reflection of himself. He became obsessed. He neglected his small garden at home. He stopped playing for the villagers. When friends came to his door, he would make excuses, his mind already far away, planning his next trip to the valley. His world, which had once been as wide as the sky, had shrunk to the size of this one obsessive quest, the quest for the perfect echo. He believed that if he could just find the right spot, play the perfect melody, and hear the most flawless reflection, he would achieve some ultimate state of satisfaction. He began to see the valley not as a place of beauty, but as a series of obstacles. The wind, which he once saw as a dance partner for his music, was now an enemy, a force that distorted and muffled his precious echo. The sound of the waterfall, once the valley's heartbeat, was now an irritating background noise that interfered with the purity of the sound. He would grow angry and frustrated, shouting at the wind, willing the waterfall to be silent. The beauty of the present moment was lost to him. He could no longer see the delicate flowers at his feet, or the way the light painted the cliffs in shades of gold and rose. He saw only his goal, and everything else was an impediment. After months of searching, he found it. High up on one side of the valley was a small, hidden ledge, a natural amphitheater of rock that seemed to have been carved for the express purpose of sound. The journey to it was treacherous, a steep climb that left him scratched and breathless. But when he arrived, he knew he had found the perfect place. The air was still. The sound of the waterfall was a distant murmur. The cliffs on the other side stood like silent, expectant giants. This was it. This would be the culmination of his search. He sat for a long time, calming his breath, composing himself. He wanted this to be perfect. He had crafted a new piece of music, the most technically brilliant and emotionally charged composition of his life. It contained all his longing, all his striving, all his desperate need to be heard. He raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The music poured out of him, a torrent of sound that filled the valley. It was a masterpiece of technique and passion. He played with a flawless precision born of endless practice, his fingers dancing over the wooden flute. He poured every last ounce of his being into the notes, holding the final high note until his breath gave out and his vision swam. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence. He stood on the ledge, his body trembling with exhaustion and anticipation, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited. And then it came. The echo. It was perfect. It was more than perfect. Every note was returned to him with a crystalline clarity he had never imagined possible. The passion, the complexity, the soaring final note, it all came back to him, a flawless mirror of his own creation. He had done it. He had achieved the perfect echo. He stood, listening, as the last note faded into the vast stillness of the valley. And as the silence settled around him once more, a strange and unexpected feeling began to rise in his chest. It was not the elation he had anticipated. It was not the deep satisfaction he had chased for so long. It was a feeling of profound, hollow emptiness. The perfect echo had given him nothing. It had only returned to him what he had already created. It was a beautiful but ultimately empty reflection of himself. It had no life of its own. It offered no new wisdom, no genuine connection. It was just his own voice sent back to him across an empty space. In his relentless pursuit of the perfect reflection, he had forgotten that a reflection, by its very nature, is not real. It is a ghost. He had spent months, had sacrificed his peace and his joy, chasing a ghost. He sank to his knees on the rocky ledge, the flute slipping from his grasp. The weight of his own foolishness was a crushing burden. He had been so focused on being heard that he had completely forgotten how to listen. He had been so desperate for the world to validate him that he had become deaf to the world itself. He sat there for a long time, perhaps for hours. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows in the valley grew long. He did not move. He was empty, but this was not the peaceful emptiness of Kale's teacup. It was the desolate emptiness of a goal achieved and found meaningless. And then, into that desolate silence, a new sound entered. It was a small sound, easily missed. It was the sound of a single bird, perched on a gnarled pine tree, clinging to the cliff face nearby. The bird began to sing. It was not a complex or brilliant song. It was a simple, repetitive little melody, just a few cheerful notes. The bird was not singing for an audience. It was not listening for an echo. It was simply singing because it was a bird, and that is what birds do. It was singing its own truth into the world, without any need for validation. Ren listened. For the first time in a very long time, he was truly listening to something other than himself. The bird's simple song was more real, more alive than the most perfect echo. It was not a reflection, it was an origin. It was a small, vibrant piece of the world's own music. He looked around, his eyes truly open for the first time since he had entered the valley. He saw the intricate patterns of lichen on the rock beside him. He saw the way the wind stirred the needles of the pine tree. He heard the distant, steady voice of the waterfall, no longer an annoyance, but a soothing, constant presence. He felt the cool breeze on his skin. The valley was not an empty stage waiting for his performance. It was a living, breathing being, full of its own quiet, subtle life. All this time he had been shouting at it, demanding that it reflect him, when he should have been sitting quietly, listening to it. He slowly picked up his flute. It felt different in his hands, no longer a tool for seeking approval, but a simple piece of wood, a vessel for breath. He did not play his grand, complex composition. He played a single, simple note. He did not blast it at the cliffs. He offered it gently to the air, a humble contribution to the valley's symphony. He did not listen for the echo. He listened to the note itself as it left his flute and became part of the world. He listened to the bird's song, the waterfall's roar, and the wind's whisper. The echo came, of course. A single, clear note returned from the cliffs. But it no longer held any power over him. It was not a validation or a judgment. It was simply one sound among many, a part of the rich and beautiful tapestry of the moment. It was no more or less important than the bird's song or the rustle of the leaves. A sense of profound peace and relaxation settled over him, a release from the terrible burden of needing to be seen. He was already a part of this world. He did not need it to reflect him to prove his existence. He played a little more, simple, quiet melodies that mingled with the sounds of the valley. He was not performing, he was participating. He was finally having a true conversation. As dusk fell, he made his way down from the high ledge. He did not feel the triumph of a conqueror, but the quiet contentment of someone who has found their way home. He left the valley behind, but he carried its true music with him. The understanding that happiness is not found in the echo of our own voice, but in the quiet, attentive listening to the voice of the world, and in the humble offering of our own small, true song to the great chorus of what is. When Ren returned to the village, people noticed a change. The frantic, haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, open gaze. He began to play his flute again, not in a desperate, solitary quest, but in the gentle, communal way he had before. He played by the stream as the women washed their clothes, his music mingling with their laughter and the rhythmic slapping of wet fabric against stone. He played in the market square, his melodies weaving through the calls of the vendors and the chatter of the shoppers. His music was no longer a demand to be heard, but a gift freely given. A small thread of beauty he wove into the fabric of daily life. He still visited the valley from time to time, but his visits were different. He no longer sought the high, treacherous ledge. He would find a comfortable spot on the mossy floor, perhaps leaning against the trunk of an old tree, and he would simply sit. He would listen for a long time before he even thought of playing. He would listen to what he now called the 5 voices of the valley, the deep, constant roar of the waterfall, the shushing whisper of the wind through the pines, the cheerful, unpredictable songs of the birds, the hum of insects in the wildflowers, and the vast, profound silence that held all the other sounds. Only when he felt he was truly a part of this orchestra would he raise his flute to his lips. And when he played, it was not to impose his own melody upon the landscape, but to find a harmony with it. He would play a phrase that followed the swooping flight of a hawk, or a rhythm that matched the gentle dripping of water from a fern. He was no longer seeking a reflection. He was seeking a connection. The echo, when it came, was just a part of that connection, a sign that the valley was listening, just as he was. One day, a young boy from the village, curious about where Ren went on his solitary walks, followed him to the valley. The boy watched from a distance as Ren sat for a long time, seemingly doing nothing. Then he watched as Ren began to play. The boy had heard Ren play many times in the village, but this was different. The music here seemed to be part of the place itself, as natural as the sound of the wind. The boy crept closer, his footsteps silent on the soft moss. Ren saw him, but he did not stop playing. He simply smiled and gestured for the boy to sit beside him. When the song was finished, the boy asked in a hushed, reverent voice, "What is the secret? How do you make the valley sing with you?" Ren looked at the towering cliffs, then at the small, curious face of the boy. He remembered his own desperate chase, his hunger for the perfect echo. He thought for a moment, then pointed to the boy's ear. "The secret is not in the flute," Ren said softly. "It is in here. For a long time I used my flute to shout at the valley, hoping it would shout back something beautiful. I was so busy shouting that I never heard what it was already saying. The valley is always singing, you see. The waterfall has a song. The wind has a song. Even the stones have a very old, very slow song. The secret is not to make them sing your tune. The secret is to listen so closely that you learn to sing theirs." He handed the flute to the boy. "Try," he said. "Don't play for the cliffs. Play for that little blue flower right there. Try to play the sound of its color." The boy, hesitant at first, took the flute. He blew a few clumsy, breathy notes. He looked up at the cliffs, waiting for a grand echo. A faint, muffled sound came back. He looked disappointed. "Don't look up there," Ren said gently. "Look down here. Forget the echo. Just look at the flower." The boy looked at the small, delicate blossom at his feet. He looked at its deep blue color, the way it trembled slightly in the breeze. He took a breath and played again. This time, it was just a single, soft, quiet note, It was not a brilliant sound, but it was a true one. And in the quiet space that followed, the note seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a perfect, tiny jewel of sound, before it was gathered up into the greater symphony of the valley. The boy's face lit up with a smile, a genuine, simple joy. He had not received a perfect echo. He had made a friend of a flower. And Ren, watching him, knew that this was the only kind of validation that truly mattered. Part 4. The First Stillness. The journey away from chasing is not always a straight path. Sometimes, after letting go of one great weight, we find ourselves picking up another, a more subtle and refined burden. Kale had learned to empty his cup of the world's desires. Ren had learned to stop seeking the world's echo. But there is a chase that can happen even within the quiet walls of a monastery, a chase not for gold or for fame, but for understanding itself. It is the mind's desperate pursuit of a final answer, the belief that peace is a puzzle to be solved. This is the story of the first true stillness, a quiet that is found not by adding knowledge, but by letting it all fall away. It is the story of a young monk named Jin and the sound of a single hand. Jin was a student of the way, and his greatest gift was also his heaviest burden, a mind as sharp and swift as a falcon. He had come to the mountain monastery as a boy, and he had excelled at everything he was taught. He could recite the ancient sutras from memory, their complex philosophies flowing from his lips like water. In debates with his fellow monks, his logic was impeccable, his arguments weaving intricate patterns that left his opponents silent and impressed. He saw the path to enlightenment as a ladder of knowledge. Each text he mastered, each concept he understood, was another rung climbed. He believed that at the very top of the ladder, a final, perfect understanding was waiting for him. He would grasp it, and then he would be free. His practice was not one of quiet sitting, but of relentless intellectual striving. He was chasing the ultimate thought. His master was a man named Ryotan, an abbot so old that his skin seemed like a delicate parchment on which the story of a long life had been written. Ryotan moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a river, and his silence was more profound than any sutra. He watched Jin, his brightest student, with eyes that held both deep affection and a quiet concern. He saw the fire of Jin's intellect, but he also saw the smoke of his spiritual pride. He saw that Jin was building a beautiful cage for himself out of the very teachings that were meant to set him free. One morning, after Jin had delivered a particularly brilliant discourse on the nature of emptiness, Ryotan called him to his private quarters. The room was bare, save for a single ink painting of a bamboo stalk bending in the wind. Ryotan sat on a simple cushion, a pot of tea steaming gently beside him. He gestured for Jin to sit. "You speak of emptiness with great eloquence," Ryotan began, his voice a low rumble. "Your mind can dance around the words like a skilled acrobat. But the word water cannot quench a thirst. The map of the road is not the journey itself." Jin bowed his head respectfully, but a flicker of pride warmed his chest. The master was acknowledging his skill. "I have a question for you," Ryotan continued, his gaze steady. "A simple one. You can hear the sound of two hands clapping." He brought his own weathered hands together, producing a single, sharp clap that echoed in the small, quiet room. "Now tell me, what is the sound of one hand clapping?" Jin's mind leaped at the question. A koan, a Zen riddle. This was the next rung on the ladder. He had read about these paradoxical questions, designed by the ancient masters to break open the logical mind. He felt a surge of excitement. This was a challenge worthy of his intellect. He would solve it, and in doing so, he would prove his deep understanding. He would present the answer to Ryotan and be acknowledged as a true heir to the teachings. "I will meditate on it, Master," Jin said, his voice humming with confidence. He bowed and left the room, his mind already racing. He went to the meditation hall, but he did not meditate. He thought. He sat on his cushion, his back straight, but his mind was a whirlwind of activity. The sound of one hand. It was a riddle, a metaphor. It could not be a literal sound. What could it be? His mind, a well-oiled machine, began to produce possibilities. Perhaps it is the sound of the wind. The wind moves without needing to strike another object to create its voice. It is a sound born of itself. Pleased with this poetic and logical answer, he went to Ryotan the next day. He found the master sweeping fallen leaves in the temple garden, his movements a slow, rhythmic dance. Jin bowed. "Master, I have the answer. The sound of one hand is the sound of the wind sighing through the pine trees." Ryotan paused his sweeping. He looked at Jin, his eyes holding no judgment, only a vast, deep quiet. He shook his head gently. "The wind sighs," he said, "but that is the sound of the wind. I asked you for the sound of one hand." He resumed his sweeping. Jin felt a prick of frustration, but he was not discouraged. His first answer had been too simple, too poetic. He needed to think more deeply. He returned to his meditation cushion. He closed his eyes and tried to listen. Not to the world outside, but to the world inside. What sound existed there, singular and alone? The rushing of blood in his ears, yes, that was it. It was a sound that was always present, a sound that required no external action. It was the sound of life itself. He waited another day before approaching the master. This time, Ryotan was tending to his collection of bonsai trees, his gnarled fingers delicately snipping a tiny branch. "Master," Jin said, bowing more formally this time, "I have listened more deeply. The sound of one hand is the sound of the blood flowing through one's own body." Ryotan set down his shears. He looked at Jin's earnest, expectant face. Again, he shook his head, a gesture as soft as a falling leaf. "Your blood flows," he said, "but that is the sound of your body. I asked you for the sound of one hand." The frustration was stronger now. It was a tight knot in Jin's stomach. The koan was not a simple riddle. It was a lock, and he did not have the right key. He spent the next week in a fever of intellectual effort. He abandoned the meditation hall and went to the monastery's library, a dusty, silent place filled with scrolls of ancient wisdom. He searched for clues, for commentaries on this famous koan. He read the words of the old masters, but their writings were like polished stones. His mind could find no purchase on their smooth surfaces. They spoke of no mind and direct experience, but these were just more words, more concepts for his mind to collect and categorize. He tried a different approach. He went out into nature. He sat by a waterfall, the roar of the water filling his senses. Is this it? The overwhelming sound that drowns out all other sounds? He presented this to Ryotan. The master, who was mending a fishing net, simply said, "That is the sound of water." He heard a cicada shrilling in the heat of the afternoon. He heard an owl hoot in the dead of night. He heard the silent growth of a bamboo shoot. Each time he thought he had found the answer, he would rush to his master, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. And each time, he was met with the same gentle, unwavering negation. That is the sound of an owl. That is the sound of a cicada. Jin's frustration began to curdle into a quiet despair. His sharp mind, the tool that had brought him so much praise and success, was useless. It was like trying to cut water with a knife. The koan was not a problem to be solved. It was a wall, smooth and seamless, against which he was beating his head. His sleep grew thin and restless. During meditation, his mind was a noisy battlefield of failed theories and desperate guesses. The other monks began to notice the change in him. The confident, brilliant scholar had been replaced by a haunted, anxious young man with dark circles under his eyes. He began to feel a deep resentment towards Ryotan. The old master seemed cruel, dangling this impossible question before him, watching him fail time and time again. Was it a game? A test of endurance? What was the point of this mental torture? One evening, his frustration boiled over. He stormed into Ryotan's quarters without waiting to be announced. The old man was sitting in the near darkness, illuminated only by a single candle. "This is impossible," Jin burst out, his voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. "There is no answer. It is a meaningless question designed to make a fool of me. I have thought of everything: the wind, the sea, my own heart, the silence of the void. Nothing is right. Just tell me the answer. Put me out of this misery." Ryotan looked up at him. The candlelight flickered in his deep, calm eyes. For the first time, he did not shake his head. He simply looked at Jin, his gaze holding a profound and gentle compassion. "You have thought of everything," Ryotan said softly. "You have brought me the sound of the wind, and the sound of the water, and the sound of your own mind's cleverness. But you have never brought me the sound of one hand." He paused, then said, "Go and sit. Do not think. Just sit. Your cup is too full of answers." Jin stumbled out of the room, his anger deflating into a vast, hollow weariness. He was defeated. He had nothing left. His brilliant mind had failed him. His will was broken. He did not go to the meditation hall. He could not bear the formal silence of that place. Instead, he wandered aimlessly through the monastery grounds, a ghost in the deepening twilight. He found himself by a small, still pond at the edge of the bamboo forest. The moon had risen, a perfect white disk, and its reflection lay on the black, glassy surface of the water. He sank down onto the damp earth at the water's edge. He did not try to meditate. He did not try to solve the koan. He did not try to do anything. He simply gave up. It was a complete and total surrender. The chase was over. He sat. The cool night air touched his hot face. A cricket began its insistent, rhythmic chirping somewhere in the darkness. The scent of damp moss and decaying leaves filled his nostrils. For the first time in months, his mind was not racing. It was not searching or striving or grasping. It was as empty and weary as he was. And in that emptiness, something began to happen. He was no longer Jin, the monk who was trying to solve a koan. He was just a presence, sitting by a pond. And the world began to reveal itself to him, not as a series of problems to be solved, but as a seamless whole of existence. He heard the cricket's song, not as a clue, but simply as the cricket's song. He saw the moon's reflection, not as a symbol, but as the moon's reflection. He felt the cool air, not as a distraction, but as the cool air. Everything was just what it was, luminous and complete in its own being. The separation between himself and the world, the division between Jin and everything else, began to dissolve. The sound of the cricket was not outside of him. The coolness of the air was not separate from his skin. The light of the moon was not different from his own awareness. Everything was arising together in a single, silent, unified field of being. And then he heard it. It was not a sound that entered his ears. It was not a thought that formed in his mind. It was a realization that bloomed in the vast, silent space that his surrender had created. The sound of two hands clapping is a sound of separation, of one thing striking another. It creates a distinction, a before and an after, a cause and an effect. It is the sound of the world of duality, the world in which his thinking mind had been trapped. The sound of one hand was the silence from which the clap arose. It was the seamless, unified reality that existed before the separation. It was the sound of the moon on the water. It was the sound of the cricket's song. It was the sound of his own quiet breath. It was not a sound at all, but the infinite, silent potential for all sound. It was the sound of being itself. It could not be thought. It could not be described. It could only be experienced, when the mind that tries to grasp it finally falls silent. A profound peace washed over him, a stillness so deep it felt as if he had come home after a lifetime of wandering. There was no excitement, no feeling of intellectual triumph. There was only a quiet, gentle, and unshakable reality. He had not solved the koan. The koan had solved him. It had dismantled the prison of his intellect, brick by brick, until all that was left was the open sky. He sat by the pond all night, not in meditation, but in simple, silent being. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, he rose and walked back to the master's quarters. He felt light, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He found Ryotan sitting in the same spot, as if he had not moved all night. The candle had burned down to a small stub. Ryotan looked up as Jin entered. He did not speak. He simply looked at him. Jin walked to the center of the room and stood before his master. He did not offer any words. He did not try to explain his experience. He simply bowed, a deep, slow bow that came from the very center of his being. He held the bow for a long moment. When he straightened up, his eyes met Ryotan's, and in the quiet space between them, the sound of one hand passed, understood. Ryotan smiled. It was the first time Jin had ever seen him truly smile, a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Ah," the old master said softly, "so you have heard it." From that day forward, Jin's practice was transformed. He still studied the sutras, but he no longer read them as a scholar seeking knowledge. He read them as a poet reads a poem about the sea while standing on the shore, feeling the spray on his face and tasting the salt in the air. The words were no longer a substitute for the experience. They were pointers, beautiful and elegant fingers gesturing toward the moon of reality. He realized the teachings were not a cage to be constructed, but a key to unlock a door that had never been locked. He became a master of silence. In the meditation hall, his stillness was no longer a rigid posture of effort, but a deep, settled quiet that seemed to spread to the monks around him. He had spent years trying to silence his mind, to force it into submission. Now he simply let it be. Thoughts would still arise, like clouds drifting across the vast sky of his awareness, but he no longer chased them, no longer fought with them. He did not identify with them. They were not his thoughts. They were just thoughts, arising and passing away in the boundless space of his silent presence. He had discovered a stillness that was not an absence of thought, but a stillness so profound that it could hold all thought, all sound, all movement, without being disturbed. His interactions with the other monks changed as well. Before, he had used his sharp intellect as a weapon in debates, seeking to win arguments and prove his superiority. Now, he listened. He listened with the same deep attentiveness with which he had finally heard the sound of one hand. He listened not just to the words people spoke, but to the silence between the words, to the feelings and intentions behind them. He no longer sought to be right, he sought to understand. His presence became a source of calm and clarity for the entire monastery. Monks with troubled minds would seek him out, not for clever answers, but to simply sit with him in his quiet, accepting presence. In his stillness, they found the space to let their own anxieties untangle. Ryotan watched the transformation with a quiet, knowing joy. He had not given Jin an answer. He had given him a question so vast and ungraspable that it had forced Jin to abandon the very tool he was relying on, his intellect. He had led his student to the edge of the conceptual world and invited him to take a step into the boundless reality beyond. One afternoon, many months later, Ryotan and Jin were walking together along the path by the pond where Jin's breakthrough had occurred. A novice monk, young and full of the same intellectual fire that had once consumed Jin, came running up to them. He was agitated, his brow furrowed with effort. "Master Ryotan," the novice exclaimed, bowing breathlessly, "I have been meditating on the koan of the cypress tree in the courtyard. I have come to understand that the tree is a symbol of our own Buddha nature, standing firm and rooted in the soil of reality." He began to launch into a long, complex philosophical explanation. Ryotan listened patiently. When the novice had finished, the old master simply smiled. Before he could speak, however, Jin bent down, picked up a fallen twig, and handed it to the young monk. "What is this?" Jin asked, his voice gentle. "A twig," the novice replied, looking confused. "Is it a symbol of a twig?" Jin asked. The novice paused, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the twig in his hand to Jin's calm, smiling face. A flicker of something, not understanding but the beginning of a question, dawned in his eyes. Jin said nothing more. He simply bowed to the novice, and he and Ryotan continued their walk. As they walked away, Ryotan placed a hand on Jin's shoulder. It was a light touch, but it conveyed a universe of meaning. The student had become the master. He no longer offered maps of the road. He offered the simple, undeniable reality of a twig in the hand. And in that simple, direct pointing, there was a stillness and a truth more profound than all the sutras in the library. Part 5. The river that flows by itself. The first stillness, the one Jin discovered by the moonlit pond, is a profound homecoming. It is the release from the frantic chase of the mind. But this stillness is not a final destination. It is a gateway. Once the mind's desperate striving ceases, we can begin to learn a new way of being in the world, a way that is not about forcing and controlling, but about yielding and flowing. It is the wisdom of effortless action, the deep peace that comes from aligning ourselves with the natural current of life. This is the wisdom of the river, a teacher that speaks not in words, but in the constant, fluid language of movement. Kale, after his encounter with the old man on the mountain, returned to a life that looked the same on the outside, but was utterly different on the inside. He still lived in his large house, but it no longer felt like a monument to his ego. It was simply a place, a collection of wood and stone that provided shelter. He still owned his ships, but he no longer felt their fortunes rise and fall with his own breath. He had emptied his cup, and in that emptiness, a quiet watchfulness had taken root. He was no longer the frantic protagonist of his own story. He was a calm observer. But this new state was not without its own challenges. His old habits of mind, the deep grooves of a lifetime of striving, were still there. He would find himself mentally calculating the profits of a passing caravan, or feeling a familiar pang of anxiety when a letter from a distant port was delayed. He would catch himself planning, strategizing, trying to control the future, trying to steer the ship of his life with a firm and anxious hand. He had let go of the desire for more, but he had not yet learned to let go of the desire for control. He had found stillness in sitting, but he had not yet found flow in living. His home was built on a hill overlooking a great river that wound its way through the valley and out to the sea. In his years of frantic accumulation, he had seen the river only as a tool, a highway for his ships, a means to an end. Now, with his new, quieter eyes, he began to truly see it. He would spend hours each day sitting in his garden, simply watching the water. At first, he watched it with the mind of a merchant. He saw its power, its relentless force, the way it could carry a heavy barge or, in a flood, tear a great tree from its banks. He saw it as a thing to be managed, to be harnessed. But as the days turned into weeks, his perception began to soften. He stopped analyzing the river and started feeling it. He began to learn its deeper lessons. The first lesson was the lesson of acceptance. The river flowed over a bed of its own making, a path carved over millennia. It did not complain about the rocks in its path. It did not struggle against the sharp bends in its course. When it came to a great boulder, a massive obstacle that could not be moved, the river did not beat against it in frustration. It did not stop. It simply yielded. It split, flowing around the rock on both sides, and rejoined itself on the other side, its journey uninterrupted. It embraced the obstacle, incorporating it into its own form. The rock, which from a rigid perspective was a problem, became, from the river's perspective, simply a part of the landscape. The river's strength was not in its force, but in its softness, its infinite capacity to adapt. Cale watched this and saw the boulders in his own life, the anxieties, the unexpected losses, the difficult people. His lifelong habit was to meet these obstacles with force, to try to smash them or push them out of his way. This struggle was the source of his exhaustion. The river showed him another way. It taught him that true strength lies not in resistance, but in yielding. To flow around the obstacle, to accept its presence without being defined by it, was a kind of power he had never understood. He began to practice this in small ways. When a shipment was delayed, instead of letting his mind race with anger and worry, he would feel the initial tension arise and then consciously soften around it. He would acknowledge the reality of the situation. The shipment is late, without adding the second, painful layer of his own resistance to that reality. He was learning to flow around the rocks in his own mind. The second lesson was the lesson of non-striving. The river was always moving, always journeying to the sea, but it was never in a hurry. It flowed with a steady, unforced momentum. It was not trying to get to the ocean, it was simply flowing. The journey and the destination were one and the same. Every moment of its existence was a complete and perfect expression of its nature. It did not worry about the waterfalls ahead or the stagnant pools it had left behind. It was entirely present, entirely itself, in each and every drop, at each and every point along its path. Cale saw his own life in contrast. He had always been striving, always trying to get somewhere else, to the next level of wealth, the next achievement. He had lived his entire life in the future, and in doing so, he had missed the life that was actually happening. The river taught him that the point of the journey is the journey itself. There is no final destination called happiness to be reached. There is only the flowing. He began to apply this to his daily life. When he ate his meals, he tried to just eat, tasting the food without thinking about the next task. When he walked through his garden, he tried to just walk, feeling the crunch of the gravel under his feet and the warmth of the sun on his skin. He was learning to let go of the destination and fall in love with the process. His anxiety, which was always rooted in a fear of the future, began to lose its power. It is difficult to be anxious when you are fully present in the simple act of drinking a cup of tea. The third and most profound lesson was the lesson of the water's own nature. Water has no fixed shape. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. In a cup, it is the cup. In a riverbed, it is the riverbed. It does not cling to any single identity. Its essence is its formlessness, its potential to be anything. Yet, it is also the most powerful and persistent of all elements, capable of wearing away mountains. This was a deep paradox. Its power came from its lack of a rigid self. Cale began to see how rigidly he clung to his own identity. He was Cale the merchant, Cale the rich man, Cale the anxious seeker. He had a fixed idea of who he was, and he spent an enormous amount of energy defending this idea, polishing it, and worrying about it. This self, this ego, was the source of all his fear. An insult could injure it. A financial loss could diminish it. The opinions of others could threaten it. It was a fragile, brittle thing that needed constant protection. The river showed him the freedom of formlessness. What if he were to let go of this fixed idea of Cale? What if he were to simply be, like the water, a responsive, fluid presence, taking the shape of each moment as it arrived? This was a terrifying thought. To let go of the self felt like a kind of death. But watching the river, he saw it was the opposite. It was the key to a larger life. The water did not lose itself by flowing into a new shape. It fulfilled itself. An opportunity to practice this came in an unexpected way. A young, ambitious merchant, a man very much like Cale himself had been 20 years earlier, began to make a series of bold and aggressive moves in the marketplace, directly challenging Cale's long-held dominance. The young man was clever and ruthless, and he began to win away some of Cale's most lucrative contracts. The old Cale would have responded with overwhelming force. He would have entered into a state of war, his mind consumed with strategies to crush this rival. He would have spent sleepless nights plotting, his stomach churning with a mixture of anger and fear. And indeed, the old habits flared up. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the tightening in his chest, the voice of his ego screaming that it was under attack. But now, there was another part of him, a quiet, watchful presence that had been nurtured by hours of sitting by the river. This presence did not get caught in the storm of his emotions, it simply observed them. He felt the anger arise, and he watched it as he might watch a dark cloud pass in the sky. He felt the fear, and he let it be there, without resisting it or being swept away by it. He remembered the river and the boulder. This rival was a boulder in his path. The old way was to smash against it. The new way was to flow around it. What would that mean in this situation? He did not know the answer intellectually, so he did not act. He simply sat with the problem, day after day, watching the river, allowing the quiet wisdom of the water to inform him. He did not fight back. He did not engage in the price wars the young merchant tried to start. When his advisors came to him with frantic reports of the rival's latest success, urging him to take action, he simply listened calmly and nodded. "Let us wait," he would say. "Let us see how the current flows." His inaction was maddening to his staff. They thought he had grown old and weak, that he had lost his nerve. What Cale was doing was not passive. It was an act of profound, active stillness. He was allowing the situation to reveal its own nature, rather than trying to force it into a shape of his own choosing. He was creating a space for a solution to emerge, rather than trying to impose one. The young merchant, accustomed to a world of aggression and reaction, was baffled by Cale's silence. He had expected a war, and he was prepared for one. But Cale's refusal to fight gave him nothing to push against. The young man escalated his efforts, taking bigger and bigger risks, trying to provoke a response. He was like a man punching water. His own frantic energy was his only opponent, and it was beginning to exhaust him. In his haste to conquer the market, he overextended himself. He took on too much debt. He made promises to his clients that he could not keep. His aggressive tactics, which at first seemed brilliant, began to unravel. One of Cale's ships, carrying a cargo of rare spices, was lost in a storm. It was a significant financial blow. His advisors were in a panic. This, they said, was the final proof that his inaction was ruinous. Cale received the news with a quiet sadness for the sailors who had lost their lives, but without the personal, ego-driven panic he would have once felt. He accepted the loss. The storm was a reality. The ship was gone. Resisting this fact would only cause more suffering. He focused on what could be done, providing for the families of the lost crew. This event, which should have been a victory for his rival, turned out to be the opposite. Cale's calm, compassionate response was noted throughout the merchant community. At the same time, the young rival, who had taken a massive loan to finance his expansion, was suddenly unable to pay his creditors. His own network, built on aggression and fear, offered him no support. His empire, which had risen so quickly, collapsed even faster. One morning, the young man appeared at the gates of Kale's house. He was humbled and defeated. He had come to beg for a loan, to ask his great rival to save him from utter ruin. Kale invited him in and served him tea in the garden overlooking the river. The young man, expecting a lecture or a gloating refusal, was disarmed by Kale's simple, quiet kindness. He told his story, confessing his arrogance and his mistakes. Kale listened, just as the old man on the mountain had listened to him. When the young man had finished, Kale looked out at the river, which flowed on, steady and serene, indifferent to the small dramas of men. "I will not give you a loan," Kale said, and the young man's face fell. "To do so would be to put you back on the same path that led you here. But I will offer you a position. My business is large and I am growing old. I need someone with your energy and your intelligence, but you must be willing to learn a new way. You must be willing to learn the wisdom of this river." He pointed to the water. "Look," he said, "it never fights, yet it conquers all things. It is because it is content to take the lowest place that it is the master of all. Your mistake was not in your ambition, but in your force. You tried to climb the mountain by running up its steepest face. The river reaches the sea by flowing, by seeking the path of least resistance, by allowing itself to be guided by the shape of the land." The young man was silent for a long time, watching the water. He had come seeking a rival and had found a teacher. He accepted the offer. Kale had not defeated his enemy, he had absorbed him. He had flowed around the obstacle, and in doing so, had transformed it into a part of his own journey. This was the fruit of his long contemplation. He had moved from the anxious stillness of one who is trying not to strive to the relaxed, dynamic flow of one who has aligned himself with the way things are. He had stopped trying to steer the boat and had learned, at last, to trust the current. His life, which had once been a frantic, exhausting battle, had become a dance. And in that dance, he found a peace more profound and durable than any stillness he had ever known. Kale's partnership with the young man, whose name was Kenji, became a living practice of this new wisdom. At first, Kenji's old habits were strong. He would bring Kale proposals for aggressive takeovers, clever schemes to outwit competitors, and anxious reports about market fluctuations. He was a mind still churning with the energy of a mountain torrent, crashing against every rock. Kale would listen patiently, his presence a calming pool of water. He would not argue with Kenji's logic. He would simply ask quiet questions. "And what will happen after we have done this? What will be the next battle?" Or, "This competitor seems to be struggling. Is it necessary to push him over the cliff? Or could we simply let the river of his own choices carry him where it will?" Or, most often, "What would happen if we did nothing at all for a while and simply watched?" Slowly, Kenji began to understand. He began to see that Kale's inaction was not weakness, but a form of deep, strategic patience. Kale was playing a much longer game, a game whose goal was not to win, but to endure, to harmonize, to maintain a state of balance. Kenji learned to distinguish between necessary action and reactive striving. He learned to feel the difference between a decision born of fear and one born of quiet clarity. His energy, which had been a destructive force, was gradually channeled by Kale's wisdom, becoming a powerful, focused current. The business did not just survive, it flourished in a new way. It became known not for its ruthlessness, but for its stability, its integrity, and its uncanny ability to navigate the turbulent waters of commerce with a serene and steady grace. Kale, in teaching, became the most profound student. He saw his old self in Kenji, the frantic, hungry ghost, and in guiding the young man, he was gently healing the remaining shadows within himself. He learned that the wisdom of the river was not a solitary practice. It was a way of being with others. Just as the river accepts the rocks and the fallen leaves, incorporating them into its flow, so too could he learn to accept the passions, fears, and ambitions of others without being disturbed by them. He could offer a space of calm in which they, too, could find their own natural course. His final years were his most peaceful. He had relinquished all titles and control of the business to Kenji, who now managed it with a blend of his own youthful energy and Kale's quiet wisdom. Kale spent his days in his garden, a place that had become his truest home. He no longer just watched the river, he felt he was a part of it. He felt the same steady, unhurried current flowing through his own aging body, carrying him gently toward the great, unknown sea. He had no fear of this final journey. The river did not fear the ocean. The ocean was not an end, but a returning. It was the river's final, perfect release from all form, its merging back into the vast, formless source from which it had come. His life had become a long, slow, and beautiful exhalation. He had learned to flow, and in flowing, he had found a peace that was as deep, as wide, and as constant as the river itself. Part 6. Finding the Ox. The journey inward has its own unique landscape. After the mind's frantic grasping has been stilled, and after we have learned to flow with the currents of life rather than fighting them, a new kind of search can begin. It is not a chase, but a quiet looking. It is the search for something we feel we have lost, but cannot name. It is a search for our own true face, the one we had before we were born. In the old Zen tradition, this journey is sometimes depicted in a series of 10 simple pictures, the story of a herder looking for his lost ox. The ox is a symbol. It is not an animal to be captured or a beast to be broken. The ox is our own original nature, our inherent wakefulness, our deepest, most authentic self. It is the boundless peace and wisdom that is our birthright. But we have wandered away from it. We have become lost in the thick forests of thought and the tangled undergrowth of desire. We have forgotten the way home, and we have forgotten the ox is even ours. We feel its absence as a vague, persistent ache, a sense of being a stranger in our own life. The story begins with the herder, alone in the wilderness, realizing his ox is gone. This is the beginning of the true search. There was a woman named Amara, who lived in a small village by a river. She was a dyer of cloth, and her hands were perpetually stained with the vibrant blues of indigo and the deep reds of madder root. Her life was simple and orderly. She rose with the sun, worked at her vats and drying racks through the day, and rested when the sky grew dark. She was not unhappy. She had friends, enough food to eat, and a roof over her head. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she was stirring a silent, steaming vat or watching the colored cloths flap gently in the breeze, a question would arise from a deep place within her. Is this all? A feeling of profound dislocation would wash over her, a sense that she was living on the surface of her own life, that her true self was somewhere else entirely, lost in a distant pasture. She began to hear the teachings, whispered by a traveling monk who rested in her village for a season. He spoke of a radiant, peaceful nature that lies within every person, a true home that can never be destroyed. He called it the Buddha nature. For Amara, it was the ox. The stories resonated with the nameless ache in her heart. This was it. This was what was missing. She had lost her ox, and now she knew she must find it. Her first search was a frantic one, driven by the old habits of the mind. She believed the ox was something to be acquired, a treasure hidden somewhere outside of herself. She thought perhaps it was hidden in knowledge. She obtained a few precious scrolls and spent her nights by candlelight, tracing the complex characters with her finger, trying to force their meaning into her mind. She read about emptiness, about non-duality, about the nature of consciousness. The words were beautiful, but they were like descriptions of food to a starving person. They did not nourish her. The more she read, the more confused she became. The ox seemed to retreat further, hidden behind a mountain of concepts and philosophies. Next, she thought the ox must be found through extreme effort. She began to meditate with a fierce, rigid determination. She would sit for hours, her back aching, her legs numb, trying to wrestle her mind into silence. She treated her thoughts as enemies, trying to banish them, to annihilate them. But the harder she fought, the more turbulent her mind became. Her meditation was not a place of peace, but a battlefield. She was trying to capture the ox by putting it in a cage of discipline. But the ox is our own free nature. It cannot be caged. The effort only exhausted her and deepened her sense of failure. Finally, she decided the problem was her surroundings. Her simple village, her daily work. It was all too ordinary. The ox, she reasoned, must be in a special, sacred place. She left her vats and her cloths in the care of a neighbor and set out on a pilgrimage. She walked for weeks, her feet growing calloused and sore. She visited famous temples that stood on mist-shrouded mountains. She stood before golden statues and listened to the chanting of 100 monks. She felt moments of awe and inspiration, but the feeling always faded, leaving behind the same familiar ache, the same sense of inner separation. The ox was not on the holy mountains. She looked everywhere for it, in the doctrines, in the rituals, in the sacred geography, everywhere except for the one place it had ever been, right where she was. She returned to her village in the late autumn, her heart heavy with defeat. The journey had stripped her of all her ideas and expectations. She had sought the ox in knowledge and found only concepts. She had sought it in effort and found only tension. She had sought it in holy places and found only echoes of other people's discoveries. She had failed. The search was over. She surrendered to her own profound sense of being lost. She went back to her work, not with joy, but with a quiet, resigned acceptance. This was her life. The smell of the dyes, the weight of the wet cloth, the heat of the fire. She expected nothing more from it. She picked up a piece of plain, undyed linen, her movements slow and automatic. She dipped it into a deep vat of indigo. She stirred the cloth with a long wooden paddle, her mind empty of all seeking. She was not trying to achieve a perfect color. She was not thinking about enlightenment or her lost ox. She was simply stirring the cloth. And in that moment of complete, unstriving presence, she saw it. It was not with her eyes. It was a perception that arose in the stillness of her mind. Down by the riverbank, in the soft mud where she had walked that morning to gather water, she suddenly became aware of a faint impression. A single, clear hoofprint. It was the track of the ox. It was not a memory, it was a direct seeing. She realized that the teachings she had read were not descriptions of a distant reality, but pointers to something that was happening right now. The scrolls had described the path, and here was the first footprint. The ox had been here. It had been here all along, walking beside her, and she had been too busy looking for it in the heavens to notice the tracks at her feet. A wave of quiet joy, so pure and gentle it almost brought her to tears, washed through her. The frantic anxiety of the search dissolved. She did not have the ox, but she had found its tracks. She knew it was real. She knew it was near. The path was not a journey to a distant land. It was a journey of waking up to where she already was. Now, the search was transformed. It was no longer a blind, desperate chase. It was a mindful, attentive following. She knew what to look for, not a mythical beast, but the subtle traces of its presence in the fabric of her ordinary life. She finished her work for the day, her movements now infused with a new, quiet grace. The next morning, she went to make tea. As she poured the hot water over the leaves, she paused. She watched the steam rise, carrying the simple, earthy fragrance. She felt the warmth of the cup in her hands. She took the first sip, and as the warm, slightly bitter liquid touched her tongue, she found another track. This feeling of simple, pure presence, of being completely one with the act of tasting the tea, this was a trace of her true nature. This was the ox, passing through her morning ritual. She began to find the tracks everywhere. When she was sweeping the floor of her workshop, she found a track in the rhythmic, swishing sound of the broom and the feeling of the smooth, worn wood of the handle in her hands. When a neighbor stopped by to share a piece of fruit, she found a track in the simple, unselfish moment of connection, in the sweetness of the fruit and the warmth of the shared smile. She found tracks in the sound of rain drumming on her roof at night, a sound that had once seemed lonely, but now felt like a lullaby. She found them in the deep, satisfying blue of a perfectly dyed piece of cloth, a color that seemed to be a manifestation of the sky itself. Her life had not changed. She still dyed her cloth, drank her tea, and swept her floor. But her perception of her life was undergoing a revolution. She had been living in a black and white world, searching for a splash of color that she believed was hidden somewhere far away. Now, she was discovering that the world had been in full, vibrant color all along. She had just not had the eyes to see it. The teachings she had once struggled to understand now made perfect sense. They were not abstract philosophies. They were field guides to the landscape of the present moment, helping her to identify the tracks of the real. The phrase, "the sacred in the ordinary," was no longer a beautiful idea. It was the lived reality of tasting tea. The concept of interconnectedness was not a theory. It was the feeling of her hands in the water that had come from the river, which had come from the rain, which had come from the sea. She realized that her true nature, the ox, was not a wild thing that had run away. It was a gentle, constant presence that had never left her side. It was the quiet awareness that was watching her stir the dye. It was the silent presence that was tasting the tea. It was the deep stillness in which the sound of the rain was heard. It had been leaving its tracks across every single moment of her life. Her striving, her seeking, her belief that it was out there was the very thing that had blinded her to its constant, intimate presence. The feeling of being an exile in her own life began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of homecoming. She was not finding something new, she was recovering something ancient and deeply familiar. She was not adding anything to herself, she was simply noticing what had been there from the very beginning. The anxiety of the search was gone, replaced by a deep and settled relaxation. There was no need to hurry. There was no need to strive. The path was not a race to a finish line. It was a gentle, moment-by-moment process of discovery. Following the tracks was a joyful and absorbing practice. Each new track was not a step closer to a distant goal, but a deeper arrival into the peace of the present. She still had not seen the ox itself. She had only seen its tracks, but that was enough. The doubt, the fear, the feeling of being lost, these had vanished. She now walked with a quiet confidence. She knew the ox was just ahead, around the next bend in the river, or perhaps even closer than that. Perhaps it was in the very next breath. The chase was over. The true journey, the gentle following of the tracks that led back to her own heart, had just begun. And in this quiet, hopeful beginning, there was a peace as deep and as wide as the evening sky. This new way of seeing began to ripple outward, changing not just her inner world, but her relationship with everything around her. Her work, which had once been a simple livelihood, became a profound practice. Each step of the dyeing process was a conversation with the ox. When she gathered plants for her dyes, the madder root from the rocky soil, the indigo leaves from the sun-drenched fields, she was no longer just harvesting. She was touching the living, breathing body of the world. She felt the life in the plants, the energy of the sun and the earth that had nourished them. She saw the tracks of the ox in the intricate patterns of a leaf, in the deep, earthy smell of a freshly dug root. When she prepared the vats, she did so with a reverence that bordered on ritual. She had learned that the art of dying was not about force, it was about creating the right conditions. The indigo vat, in particular, was a living entity, a delicate ecosystem of bacteria and chemistry that had to be coaxed, not commanded. It required patience, warmth, and a gentle, intuitive touch. Some days, the vat would be vibrant and strong. Other days, it would be sullen and weak. In the past, she would have grown frustrated, seeing a weak vat as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to her work. Now, she saw it differently. She saw the state of the vat as a reflection of a larger, unseen reality. She would sit with it, feel its temperature, smell its unique fermented scent, and listen. She was listening for what it needed. This patient, receptive listening was another track of the ox. It was the wisdom of non-imposition, of working with the nature of things rather than against it. Her finished cloths began to carry a different quality. People in the village noticed it. Her colors had always been beautiful, but now they seemed to possess a depth, a luminosity that they hadn't had before. A simple piece of blue linen seemed to hold the stillness of the midnight sky. A bolt of red silk seemed to glow with the warmth of a setting sun. Her customers could not have explained it, but they felt it. They felt the peace and presence that she had woven into the very fibers of the cloth. Amara's work was no longer just a craft. It had become an art, an expression of her own deepening communion with the world. She even found the tracks of the ox in the difficult moments. One season, a long drought settled over the land. The river shrank, and the plants she used for her dyes began to wither. In her old life, this would have been a source of great anxiety. Her livelihood was threatened. The fear of scarcity would have consumed her. Now, while she still felt a natural concern, the deep, gut-wrenching anxiety was absent. She walked through her parched garden, touching the dry, curling leaves of the indigo plants. She felt the thirst of the earth, and in that shared experience of suffering, she found another track. The ox was not just present in the beautiful and the pleasant, it was here too, in the hardship, in the vulnerability, in the shared reality of impermanence. The drought was not a personal affliction, it was a condition of the world, and she was a part of that world. This acceptance, this feeling of shared being even in difficulty, was a profound peace. It was the track of a deep, unshakable equanimity. She did not find a magical solution to the drought. She simply did what was possible. She conserved water. She focused on dyes that required less of it. She mended old clothes instead of dyeing new ones. She met the reality of the situation with a quiet, practical grace, not with a storm of internal resistance. And in this simple, responsive action, she felt the presence of her true nature more strongly than ever. The ox was not something that would make all her problems disappear. It was the steady, calm heart that could meet all problems without being broken by them. The traveling monk who had first spoken of the Buddha nature passed through her village again a year later. He found her sitting by her workshop, mending a fishing net for one of her neighbors. He sat with her for a while, and they shared a cup of tea in a comfortable silence. Finally, he asked, "Did you ever find what you were looking for?" Amara looked up from her work, her hands still moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She looked at the monk, and her eyes were clear and bright, like the surface of a still pond. She did not speak of scrolls or temples or meditation techniques. She simply smiled, a smile that seemed to rise from a deep, quiet wellspring of contentment. "I have stopped looking," she said, "and I have started to see. It turns out the pasture is everywhere." She held up the net she was mending. "There are tracks in the weaving of these knots," she said softly. She gestured to the teacup in his hand. "And in the warmth of this clay." She looked out at the dusty village lane where a dog was sleeping in a patch of sun. "And over there, in the breath of that sleeping dog." The monk looked at her, and he saw that her search had ended in the most wonderful way possible. She had not captured the ox and locked it in a pen. She had realized that she was the herder, the ox, and the pasture all at once. The separation had been an illusion, a dream from which she was now, gently and quietly, waking up. He bowed to her, not as a teacher to a student, but as one traveler to another who has found the true path, the one that is hidden in plain sight, right under our own feet. Part 7. The Beauty of the Cracked Pot. After the tracks of the ox have been found, after we begin to see the traces of our true nature in the simple fabric of our lives, a new and gentle phase of the journey begins. It is a period of deep relaxation, of learning to be at peace with ourselves exactly as we are. The striving to find something has ceased, and now the striving to perfect ourselves can also be allowed to fall away. We spend so much of our lives hiding or trying to fix what we perceive as our flaws, our cracks, our imperfections. We carry a deep-seated belief that to be worthy, we must be whole, flawless, and complete. But the wisdom of the way teaches us something different. It teaches that our cracks can be the very channels through which grace flows into the world. It is the story of finding beauty not in perfection, but in the unique and lovely truth of what is broken. It is the story of the water-bearer and his 2 pots. In a small village that baked in the sun, there lived an old man named Ananda. Every morning, for many, many years, he would walk the long, dusty path from his master's house down to the cool, clear river. And every morning, he would return with 2 large clay pots full of water. The pots hung from either end of a long wooden pole that he balanced across his shoulders. The 2 pots were very different. One of them, whose name was Purna, was perfect. Its surface was smooth and even, its shape was symmetrical and strong, and it had been fired in the kiln to a flawless terracotta finish. Purna was proud of its perfection. Every morning it would be filled to the brim at the river, and every morning it would deliver its full measure of water to the master's house without losing a single drop. It fulfilled its purpose without fault, and in this it found a deep sense of satisfaction and rightness. It saw itself as a model of what a pot should be. The other pot, whose name was Kina, was not perfect. A long time ago, a thin, almost invisible crack had appeared on its side, running from its lip halfway down its belly. It was a small flaw, but it was enough. Every morning, Kina would also be filled to the brim at the river, but on the long walk back up the path, it would leak. A slow, steady trickle of water would escape from its crack, pattering softly onto the dusty ground. By the time Ananda reached his master's house, Kina was always only half full. For 2 years, this went on, day after day. The perfect pot, Purna, remained silent and smug in its own efficiency, and the cracked pot, Kina, was consumed by a deep and bitter shame. It felt like a failure. It saw itself as a broken, useless thing, able to perform only half of the task for which it was made. It was tormented by the constant evidence of its own imperfection. The feeling of the water slowly seeping out of its side was a constant, physical reminder of its inadequacy. It would watch the dark, damp spot it left on the path behind it and feel a fresh wave of misery. It was wasting the old man's effort. It was a burden. It would listen to the sound of the water sloshing inside Purna, a full, deep, resonant sound. Its own sound was lighter, shallower, a sound that diminished with every step. The comparison was a form of torture. It longed to be like Purna, to be whole, to be worthy of the task it had been given. The shame was a shadow that darkened its entire existence. It could not see the beauty of the morning sun, or feel the gentle breeze, or appreciate the patient strength of the old man who carried it. Its world had shrunk to the size of its own crack. Finally, one morning, as Ananda was stooping to fill it at the river's edge, Kina could bear its shame no longer. It spoke, its voice a quiet, miserable whisper that seemed to come from the very heart of the clay. "I am so sorry, Master," it said. "I must apologize to you." Ananda paused, his hands still in the cool water. He looked at the pot with his kind, gentle eyes, eyes that had seen many seasons come and go. "Apologize?" he asked, his voice soft. "For what, little pot?" "For my flaw," Kina whispered, the words trembling with 2 years of accumulated sorrow. "This crack in my side. For 2 years I have watched the water leak out of me all the way back to your master's house. Because of me, you do all this work, you walk this long path, and you only get half the reward. I am a failure. I am not worthy of you." Ananda listened. He did not interrupt. He did not immediately offer reassurance. He simply received the pot's deep and painful confession. He finished filling both pots, and then gently lifted the pole onto his shoulders. The weight settled into the familiar grooves on his weathered skin. He looked at Kina, and a slow, gentle smile spread across his face, a smile that seemed to hold the wisdom of the river itself. "As we walk back to the house today," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to notice the beautiful flowers on your side of the path." Kina was confused. What did flowers have to do with its failure? It had never noticed any flowers. It had only ever noticed the dusty ground, the dark stain of its own leaked water, and the perfect, dry path on Purna's side. But it was a humble pot, and it would do as its master asked. As they began the long walk up the hill, Kina did its best to look. For the first time, it turned its attention away from its own inner world of shame and looked outward. And what it saw took its breath away. On its side of the path, growing in a long, vibrant line, was a profusion of the most beautiful wildflowers. There were brilliant yellow sunstars, deep purple morning glories, and delicate white moonflowers. Their colors were a riot of life and joy against the dry, brown earth. They grew in a thick, lush ribbon of beauty that followed the path all the way up the hill. Bees and butterflies danced among them, their wings a blur of motion in the warm morning air. Kina was stunned. It had walked this path thousands of times and had never seen this. It had been so consumed by its own flaw that it had been blind to the beauty that was right beside it. It watched, mesmerized, as the flowers swayed in the breeze, their faces turned up to the sun. And as it watched, it noticed something else. It saw its own water, the water it had thought was wasted, trickling down from its side and sinking into the earth right at the roots of the flowers. It saw the dark, damp soil from which they grew, a soil that was rich and fertile, while the other side of the path was barren and dusty. The truth dawned on it, a realization so simple and so profound that it seemed to shake its very being. This beauty was here because of its crack. Its flaw, the source of all its shame, was also the source of all this life. When they reached the master's house, Ananda gently set the pots down. Kina was, as always, only half full, but for the first time, it did not feel shame. It felt a quiet, astonished wonder. Ananda looked at the pot and saw the change in its silent presence. He smiled again. "Did you see the flowers, little pot?" he asked. Kina could not speak, but its silence was full of a new understanding. "Did you not see," Ananda continued, his voice full of a deep, gentle affection, "that I have always known about your flaw? I knew about your crack from the very beginning, and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day, as we have walked back from the river, you have been watering them." He gestured back down the path, where the line of flowers was a bright stroke of color in the morning light. "For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate my master's table. Without you being just the way you are, with your unique and particular flaw, there would be none of this beauty to grace his house." He reached out and gently touched the crack on Kina's side, his finger tracing its jagged line. "This crack is not a mistake," he said softly. It is a channel. It is the way your special gift is given to the world. Purna is excellent. It is perfect in its own way. It delivers the water for the cooking and the washing. Its purpose is to be full. But your purpose is different. You deliver less water, but you also deliver life. You deliver beauty. You are not a broken version of Purna. You are a perfect version of yourself. In that moment, Kina's world was remade. The shame it had carried for so long dissolved, not into pride, but into a deep and peaceful acceptance. It was not flawed. It was unique. Its brokenness was not a liability. It was an asset. It was the very thing that allowed it to create something beautiful and unexpected. From that day on, Kina's experience of the daily journey was transformed. It no longer felt the water leaking as a sign of failure. It felt it as an act of giving, of nurturing. The soft patter of the drops on the dusty path was no longer a sound of loss, but a quiet, life-giving song. It still saw Purna, full and perfect on the other side of the pole, but it no longer felt the sting of comparison. It felt a sense of kinship. They were two pots, each with its own nature, each with its own purpose, both serving the master in their own perfect way. This is the deep relaxation that comes when we stop chasing the illusion of our own perfection. Each of us is a cracked pot. We all have our flaws, our wounds, our histories, our unique and sometimes painful imperfections. We spend so much energy trying to hide them, to fix them, to pretend they are not there. We compare ourselves to the seemingly perfect pots around us and feel a deep sense of inadequacy. But the wisdom of the cracked pot invites us to look at our flaws from a different perspective. It asks us to consider that our wounds may be the very places where our light, our compassion, our unique gifts can shine through. The person who has known deep sorrow can offer a more profound comfort. The person who has struggled with failure can offer a more authentic encouragement. The person who has felt broken can have a greater capacity for empathy. Our cracks are what make us human. They are what make us relatable. They are what prevent us from becoming hard, sealed, and impenetrable vessels. To accept our own imperfections is an act of profound kindness to ourselves. It is to let go of the exhausting struggle to be someone else and to relax into the simple, beautiful truth of who we are. It is to realize that our life is not a problem to be solved, but a unique and unrepeatable expression of being. Like the water-bearer, the universe knows about our cracks, and in its vast and mysterious wisdom, it has planted flowers along our path, waiting for our unique and imperfect gifts to water them into existence. The journey is not about becoming a perfect pot, it's about learning to see the flowers. And in that seeing, we find a peace that is not based on being flawless, but on the deep, quiet joy of being authentically, beautifully, and imperfectly ourselves. This acceptance was not a one-time event for Kina, but a continuous unfolding. It was a practice of remembering. There were still days when the old habit of comparison would arise. It would see Purna, standing tall and full, catching the morning light on its smooth, unbroken surface, and a faint echo of the old shame would stir. But now, it had a new place to put its attention. Instead of dwelling on its own perceived lack, it would consciously turn its gaze to the flowers. It would look for the newest bloom, notice the way a drop of its own water clung like a jewel to a petal, or watch a bee gathering nectar. This simple act of shifting its focus from its inner world of judgment to the outer world of beauty was a powerful form of meditation. It was a choice, made again and again, to align itself with grace rather than with grievance. The relationship between the two pots also began to change. Before, there had been a silent wall between them, built of Kina's shame and Purna's quiet pride. Now, that wall began to dissolve. One day, Purna, who had overheard the conversation between Ananda and Kina, spoke for the first time. Its voice was clear and strong, just as one would expect. "I have been watching the flowers," Purna said, its tone holding a new note of curiosity. They are indeed very beautiful. My water helps to cook the master's food and wash his clothes. It serves a purpose inside the house. But your water, it creates beauty for the whole world to see. There was no condescension in its voice, only a simple, honest observation. For the first time, Purna was seeing beyond its own function. It was recognizing that there were different kinds of purpose, different kinds of value. "We are not the same," Kina replied, its voice no longer a whisper, but a soft, steady murmur, like water flowing over smooth stones. "But we are carried on the same pole, by the same master, from the same river. Our journeys are linked." This was a profound realization for both of them. They were not in competition, they were partners in a larger dance. Purna's fullness and Kina's leaking were not opposing qualities of success and failure. They were complementary aspects of a single, unified action. Ananda needed both the water that arrived in the house and the beauty that grew along the path. One was not better than the other. Both were essential. This understanding brought a new harmony to their daily task. They began to feel the rhythm of the old man's walk, not as a solitary burden, but as a shared experience. They felt the gentle sway of the pole that connected them. They learned to balance each other. As Kina grew lighter, Purna's weight would subtly shift, and Ananda's practiced shoulders would adjust, maintaining the equilibrium of the whole. They were a system, a small, moving ecosystem of purpose, each contributing its unique nature to the whole. This story mirrors the journey of self-acceptance. We often live in a state of internal division. We have a Purna self, the part of us that is competent, successful, and conforms to our ideals. This is the self we present to the world, the self we are proud of. And we have a Kina self, the part that is wounded, insecure, and imperfect. This is the self we hide, the self that is the source of our shame. We spend our lives trying to make our entire being into Purna, believing that if we could just eliminate the cracked, leaky parts of ourselves, we would finally be happy. But this is a war against ourselves, and it is a war that can never be won. The peace of the cracked pot is the peace of integration. It is the moment we realize that our wholeness does not come from eliminating our cracks, but from embracing them. It is the understanding that the Purna self and the Kina self are not enemies. They are partners, carried on the same pole of a single life. The competent part of us allows us to function in the world, to provide for ourselves and others. But it is often the cracked part of us, the part that has known suffering and vulnerability, that allows us to create beauty, to connect with others on a deeper level, and to grow in compassion and wisdom. To embrace our inner Kina is to forgive ourselves for not being perfect. It is to look at our own history of mistakes, our insecurities, our fears, not with judgment, but with the same gentle, compassionate eyes that Ananda had. It is to ask the question, what flowers have grown along the path because of this very crack? Perhaps a past failure has taught us humility. Perhaps a deep wound has made us more sensitive to the pain of others. Perhaps a long struggle with anxiety has given us a profound appreciation for moments of simple peace. When we stop judging our cracks and start looking for the flowers, our entire inner landscape begins to change. The energy we once spent on hiding and fixing is liberated. We can relax. We can breathe. We can begin to appreciate the unique, unrepeatable beauty of our own life's journey, with all its bumps and leaks and unexpected blossoms. We realize that the goal is not to arrive at the destination with a full pot, but to live the journey in such a way that we leave a trail of beauty behind us, a trail watered by the very things we once believed were our greatest flaws. This is the deep, quiet, and profoundly liberating relaxation of the cracked pot. Part 8. The Moon in the Dewdrop. The journey of self-acceptance, of learning to love our own cracked and beautiful nature, brings a profound and settled peace. It is the end of the war with ourselves, and in the quiet landscape of this inner peace, a new kind of vision becomes possible. The frantic search for a distant happiness is over. The anxious effort to become someone better has ceased. Now all that is left is to be here, in this moment, in this life, exactly as it is. And it is here, in the heart of the ordinary, that the most extraordinary discoveries are made. It is the realization that the entire universe, in all its boundless majesty, is present in the smallest, most fleeting of things. It is the wisdom of seeing the full moon reflected in a single drop of dew. In a monastery perched high on a mountain, there lived an old monk named Kogan. He was not the abbot. He was not a famous teacher who gave fiery sermons or posed baffling koans. In fact, most of the young novices who came to the monastery barely noticed him at all. Kogan was the one who swept the paths, who tended the vegetable garden, who mended the torn paper screens, and who washed the rice for the morning meal. His life was a quiet rhythm of simple, repetitive tasks. He was a creature of the ordinary, as unassuming as a weathered stone on the path he so carefully swept. Among the new arrivals at the monastery was a young man named Haru. Haru was full of a bright, burning zeal. He had come to the mountains seeking enlightenment, a great, transformative experience that he imagined would be like a lightning strike, a sudden, explosive awakening that would change everything forever. He devoted himself to long hours of meditation, his body aching with the effort to still his restless mind. He listened intently to the abbot's lectures, filling his head with complex doctrines and the subtle philosophies of the ancient masters. He saw the path as a great mountain to be conquered, and he was determined to be the first to reach its summit. In his quest for the extraordinary, Haru had no time for the ordinary. He saw Kogan's endless chores not as a form of practice, but as simple labor, the work of someone not advanced enough for the real training of meditation and study. He would see the old monk in the pre-dawn chill, his back bent, sweeping the fallen pine needles from the stone courtyard. Haru would hurry past him on his way to the meditation hall, his mind already wrestling with concepts of emptiness and form, and he would feel a faint sense of pity for the old man, whose life seemed so mundane, so devoid of the great spiritual drama that Haru was seeking. But as the seasons turned, Haru's frantic efforts began to bear little fruit. His mind in meditation was a stormy sea of thoughts. The abbot's teachings, while profound, felt like beautiful, abstract maps of a country he could not find. His zeal was slowly being worn down into a quiet, persistent frustration. The lightning strike of enlightenment did not come. He felt as if he were trying to grasp the wind. It was during this time of discouragement that his duties were changed. He was assigned to work in the kitchens, and his primary task each morning was to assist Kogan in washing the great cauldrons of rice, the community. Haru was disappointed. This was a step backward, a distraction from his real work. But he was a monk, and he obeyed. And so, every morning before the sun had risen, Haru would stand beside Kogan at the large stone sinks, plunging his hands into the icy mountain water. At first, he performed the task mechanically, his mind 1,000 miles away, rehearsing the abbot's words or planning his next assault on his own thoughts in the meditation hall. But Kogan's presence was a quiet and powerful thing. The old monk did not seem to be merely washing rice. He was engaged in a silent, intimate conversation with it. He would let the white grains run through his fingers with a gentle, caressing motion. He would listen to the sound the water made as it swirled around the pot, a soft, whispering sound. There was no hurry in his movements, no sense of a chore to be finished. His attention was complete, absolute. The entire universe, for Kogan, seemed to be contained in that pot of rice and water. Haru began to watch him. He watched as Kogan finished with the rice and then began to clean the kitchen. He cleaned not with the grim determination of someone tidying up, but with a kind of gentle reverence. He would wipe down the wooden countertops, his cloth following the grain of the wood. He would scrub the great iron pots until they shone. Each object was treated as if it were precious, sacred. There was no separation between the task and the man. Kogan and the act of cleaning were one and the same. After their work in the kitchen was done, Haru would often see Kogan out in the temple grounds. He would watch him pull a single, stubborn weed from the moss garden, his touch as delicate as a painter's. He would watch him spend an entire afternoon repairing a small tear in a paper screen, his patience seemingly infinite. Kogan's life was a seamless flow of these small, attentive acts. He never seemed to be waiting for something more important to happen. What he was doing in that moment was the most important thing in the world. A question began to form in Haru's mind, a question that slowly chipped away at his own ideas of what spiritual practice was. He saw the abbot, who spent his days in study and giving lectures. He saw the senior monks, who spent long hours locked in deep meditation. And he saw Kogan, who spent his days in simple, manual labor. And yet, of all the people in the monastery, it was the old, unassuming Kogan who seemed to possess the most profound and unshakable peace. It radiated from him, a quiet, gentle light. It was in the calm of his eyes, the economy of his movements, and the simple, contented smile that often played on his lips. One morning, Haru could contain his confusion no longer. They were standing outside the kitchen, just as the first rays of the sun were striking the great bronze temple bell. The air was cool and damp, and the world was washed in a soft, grey light. "Master Kogan," Haru began, title of master slipping out naturally for the first time. "May I ask you a question?" Kogan turned from watching the sunrise and looked at Haru, his gaze clear and direct. He simply nodded. "I see you every day," Haru said, the words tumbling out in his earnestness. "You are always working. You sweep, you cook, you weed, you mend. But I never see you engaged in formal practice. You are not in the meditation hall for the long sittings. You do not spend your days with the sutras. So, I must ask, when do you practice? When do you find the time to seek enlightenment?" Kogan was silent for a long moment. He did not seem to be thinking of an answer. He seemed to be listening, both to Haru's question and to the quiet sounds of the awakening world around them. A gentle smile touched his lips. "Come," he said softly, and he beckoned Haru to follow him. He led Haru not to the meditation hall or the library, but to the moss garden, which was still shrouded in a fine, cool mist. The moss was a deep, velvety green, and it was covered in a million tiny, perfect spheres of dew. The world was so still that each dewdrop hung, trembling slightly, on the tip of a single strand of moss. Kogan knelt down, his old knees making no sound on the damp earth. He gestured for Haru to kneel beside him. He pointed with a weathered finger to a single, perfect dewdrop that was clinging to a blade of grass near a stone lantern. "Look," he whispered. "What do you see?" Haru leaned in close. He saw a tiny, transparent globe of water, a thing of fragile, fleeting beauty. "I see a drop of water, Master," he replied. "Look closer," Kogan urged, his voice barely a breath. "Look into it." Haru put his face so close to the dewdrop that his own breath clouded the air around it. He focused his eyes, and as he did, his perception shifted. Inside the tiny, luminous sphere, he saw a reflection. It was not just a reflection of the sky, it was a perfect, complete, and miniature world. He could see the dark, curving roof of the temple hall. He could see the ancient pine tree that stood beside it. He could see the vast, pale expanse of the morning sky. And then he saw it. Hanging in the sky within the dewdrop was the moon, a faint, silvery crescent that had not yet faded from the sky. The entire world, the whole vast scene, moon and all, was held, complete and unbroken, within the tiny, fragile space of that single drop of water. He stared, breathless. The immensity of the sky and the smallness of the dewdrop were not two different things. They were one. The great was perfectly contained in the small, without the small being overwhelmed or the great being diminished. He looked up from the dewdrop and met Kogun's eyes. The old monk was smiling, a smile of deep, knowing peace. "You ask me when I practice," Kogun said, his voice as soft as the mist. "When I sweep the leaves, I am not just sweeping. I am sweeping. The whole universe is in the feeling of the bamboo handle in my hands and the sound of the bristles on the stone. When I wash the rice, I am not just washing rice. The whole teaching of the masters is in the coolness of the water and the feel of the grains slipping through my fingers." He gestured again to the dewdrop, where the moon still floated in its tiny, perfect sky. "You are looking for enlightenment as if it is the moon, a great distant thing in the sky. You are trying to build a ladder to reach it, but you do not need a ladder. The entire moon is right here, in this single drop of dew. It is in the taste of your tea. It is in the sound of your own breath. It is in the feeling of your feet on the path. There is no need to chase it. You only need to be still enough and present enough to see it, right where you are." He stood up slowly. "My sweeping is my meditation," he said. "My cooking is my sutra. My whole life is the practice. There is no other." He bowed his head slightly to Haru and then turned to walk back towards the kitchen, his bare feet making soft, damp prints on the stone path. Haru remained kneeling in the wet moss for a long time, the world transformed. The separation he had felt between practice and life dissolved. The distinction between the sacred and the mundane vanished. It was all one piece. Enlightenment was not a future event to be achieved. It was a present reality to be noticed. He went about his day, but with a new heart and new eyes. When he washed his own simple bowl after the morning meal, he did it with the same reverence he had seen in Kogun. He felt the warmth of the water, saw the gleam of the glazed clay, and listened to the sound of the cloth against its surface. And in that simple act, he felt a peace and a presence that 1,000 hours of his striving meditation had never given him. He was not just washing a bowl, he was holding the whole world in his hands. He had been chasing the moon in the sky, a distant, abstract idea of happiness. Kogun had shown him how to find it right here, in the humble, fleeting dewdrop of the present moment. And in that simple, profound shift of perception, Haru found the beginning of the peace he had been seeking all along. It was not a lightning strike. It was a quiet, gentle dawning, as soft and as beautiful as the moon in a drop of morning dew. Haru's life in the monastery was fundamentally altered. He did not abandon his zazen practice or his study of the sutras, but their purpose was now different. He no longer sat in the meditation hall trying to achieve a special state, trying to force his mind into a silent blankness. Instead, he sat simply to practice being present, to cultivate the same quality of deep, quiet attention that Kogun brought to every moment. Meditation was no longer a battle to be won, but a gentle returning, a coming home to the stillness that was always there beneath the surface of his thoughts. He was not trying to get somewhere else. He was practicing the art of being fully where he already was. When he read the scriptures, he no longer treated them as intellectual puzzles to be solved. He read them slowly, allowing the words to sink in, listening for their resonance within his own direct experience. The phrase, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," had once been a baffling philosophical concept. Now, as he looked at his simple wooden rice bowl, he began to understand it in a new way. He saw the bowl not as a solid, separate object, but as a temporary coming together of countless conditions. The tree from which the wood was carved, the sun and rain that nourished the tree, the skill of the craftsman who shaped it, the generations of monks who had eaten from it. All of these were present in the simple reality of the bowl. And when the bowl one day broke and returned to dust, these conditions would disperse and reform as something else. The bowl was empty of a separate, permanent self, and this very emptiness was the source of its form. The sutra was not an abstract idea, it was a perfect description of his rice bowl. It was a dewdrop containing the moon. His greatest practice, however, became his daily work. The chores he had once despised became his most cherished teachers. He learned the Dharma of water, its persistence, its softness, its ability to cleanse and to take the shape of any vessel. He learned the Dharma of the weeds in the garden, their tenacious will to live, their perfect expression of the life force, no less sacred than the carefully cultivated vegetables. He learned the Dharma of the broom, the simple, satisfying act of bringing order and clarity to a small patch of the world. He began to spend more time with Kogen, not as a formal student asking questions, but as a quiet apprentice, working alongside him in a comfortable silence. He learned more from Kogen's silence than he had from all the abbot's lectures. He learned that true wisdom is not something you possess in your head. It is something you embody in your hands, in your feet, in the way you walk, in the way you hold a teacup. One afternoon, they were mending the monastery roof, replacing old, cracked tiles with new ones. It was slow, meticulous work under the hot sun. Haru, his old habits of striving not yet completely gone, was focused on finishing the task, on getting the row of tiles laid as quickly as possible. His movements were efficient, but slightly tense. Kogen, working beside him, moved at a different pace. He would pick up a new tile, and for a moment, he would simply hold it. He would feel its weight, its rough texture, the coolness of the baked clay. He would look at its color, a deep, earthy gray. Then, with a single, precise and unhurried movement, he would set it in its place, tapping it gently with a wooden mallet until it settled perfectly among its neighbors. Each tile was a complete world, a total event. A sudden gust of wind blew across the roof, and a loose tile from a section they had not yet repaired slid down and shattered on the stone courtyard below. Haru flinched, annoyed at the interruption, at the mess, at the broken thing. Kogen simply paused and looked down at the scattered, broken shards. He did not frown, he did not sigh. He watched them for a moment, and then a soft smile touched his face. "Ah," he said quietly, as if greeting an old friend. "Impermanence." He then turned back to the new tile in his hand, gave it the same quiet, full attention as before, and set it in its place. In that small moment, Haru saw the depth of Kogen's practice. Kogen's peace was not dependent on things being perfect or whole. He did not resist the reality of the broken tile. He did not cling to the wholeness of the new tile. He met each moment, whether of wholeness or of brokenness, with the same calm, accepting, and fully present awareness. His enlightenment was not a shield that protected him from the world. It was an open heart that allowed him to experience the world exactly as it was, in all its beauty and all its brokenness, without resistance. Haru realized that he had been seeking a happiness that was conditional, a happiness that would arrive when his mind was quiet, when his understanding was perfect, when his life was in order. Kogen's happiness was unconditional. It was not dependent on anything. It was the simple, profound joy of being awake to reality, moment by moment. It was the joy of seeing the moon in the perfect dewdrop, and it was also the quiet acceptance of seeing the dewdrop evaporate in the morning sun. Both were part of the same beautiful, fleeting dance. And to be present for that dance, in whatever form it took, was the only practice and the only enlightenment there ever was. Part 9. The Empty Boat. As the journey inward deepens, we arrive at a place of profound and simple stillness. We have learned to see the sacred in the ordinary, to find peace in our own imperfections. But there remains one final, subtle fortress to be surrendered: the self. It is the deep, instinctual feeling of being a separate I inside this body, an entity that needs to be protected, defended, and proven right. This self, this ego, is the root of our deepest anxieties and our most violent reactions. It is the captain of a small, fragile boat, constantly on guard, ready to shout at any other vessel that comes too close. The final relaxation, the gateway to a truly peaceful sleep, is found in the wisdom of letting this captain go, of allowing our boat to become empty. There was once a great general named Takeda. His name was a thunderclap in the ears of his enemies and a banner of pride for the men he commanded. He was a man forged in the fires of 100 battles, his body a map of scars, his mind a brilliant and ruthless instrument of strategy. He was the very definition of a man full of self. His identity was inseparable from his title, his honor, his reputation. He was General Takeda, and the world was expected to arrange itself accordingly. His anger was as famous as his courage. It was a clean, hot fire that he used as a weapon. A foolish subordinate, a clumsy servant, a rival who showed the slightest disrespect, all would feel the searing heat of his wrath. He believed this anger was a sign of his strength, a necessary tool for maintaining discipline and projecting power. He did not see it as a poison that was slowly corrupting his own heart. He lived in a state of constant, low-grade tension. His boat was always manned. He was always at the helm, scanning the horizon for threats, for insults, for challenges to his authority. Life was a series of collisions, and his response was always the same: to shout, to blame, to assert his own rightness. This way of being had made him a successful general, but it had made him a stranger to peace. His nights were not restful. He would lie on his sleeping mat, his mind still fighting battles, replaying slights, planning his next move. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow, troubled affair. The turning point came not on a battlefield, but in his own garden. His only son, a quiet, thoughtful young man named Kenji, had chosen the path of a scholar over that of a warrior. This was a deep and constant source of disappointment for Takeda. One afternoon, he was trying to teach Kenji the art of the sword, a practice the boy had no talent or love for. Kenji, distracted, made a clumsy move, and the wooden practice sword slipped from his grasp, landing harmlessly at Takeda's feet. A volcano of rage erupted inside the general. It was not about the dropped sword, it was about everything: his son's perceived weakness, the dishonor to the family name, the frustration of not being able to control his own heir. He unleashed a torrent of harsh, belittling words, his voice echoing through the serene garden. Kenji did not flinch. He simply looked at his father, and in his eyes there was not fear, but a deep, quiet sadness. "Your anger is a cage, father," Kenji said, his voice barely a whisper, "and you are the only one trapped inside it." He then bowed, turned, and walked away, leaving Takeda alone with his sword and his roaring, impotent rage. The boy's words struck the general with more force than any enemy's blade. A cage. He looked at his own hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He felt the pounding of the blood in his temples, the tightness in his chest. He was, in that moment, a prisoner of his own fury, and for the first time he felt the deep, exhausting suffering of his own strength. Shaken, he sought the counsel of a wise old minister at the court, a man who had seen many generals come and go. The minister listened patiently to Takeda's story. When he had finished, the old man did not offer advice on strategy or discipline. He told him a story about a hermit who lived by a great mist-shrouded lake in the northern provinces. The hermit, he said, was a master of a different kind of warfare, the war within. Driven by this new and unsettling crack in the armor of his self, Takeda journeyed north. He left behind his armor, his retinue, and his title. He traveled as a simple pilgrim, a man at war with himself, seeking an unknown remedy. He found the hermit, Etsudo, living in a small, weathered hut by the shore of the vast, quiet lake. Etsudo was not what he expected. He was a small, wiry man with the gnarled hands of a fisherman and eyes that held the calm, endless depth of the lake itself. Takeda, his old habits of command still strong, announced himself and his purpose. He spoke of his anger, his power, and the cage his son had spoken of. He demanded to be taught the hermit's secrets. Etsudo listened, just as the lake listened to the wind, receiving the turbulence without being disturbed. When Takeda was finished, the hermit simply smiled. "Your boat is very full," he said. "It is heavy with a great general and all his victories. It is a wonder it has not sunk." He then gestured to a small, simple boat tied to a rickety pier. "The lake is calm today. Let us go out on the water." Confused and slightly annoyed by the hermit's strange response, Takeda followed him into the boat. Etsudo took the oars and began to row, his movements fluid and effortless. They moved out from the shore into the heart of the lake. A thick, white mist hung over the water, muffling all sound and blurring the line between water and sky. They were in a world of grey, silent emptiness. Takeda felt a growing unease. He was a man of action and clear objectives. This formless, silent world was a kind of prison to him. They sat in silence for a long time, the boat drifting. Then, out of the mist, another boat appeared, moving directly towards them. It was on a collision course. Etsudo did nothing. He simply sat, his hands resting on the oars. "Look out, old man!" Takeda bellowed, his general's instinct taking over. "Steer away! That fool is going to hit us!" The other boat continued its approach, silent and steady. Takeda's anger flared. The disrespect, the carelessness. In his world, lesser men made way for him. "Hey!" he shouted into the mist, his voice raw with fury. "You blind fool! Watch where you are going! Do you know who I am?" The boat bumped into theirs with a soft, hollow thud. The impact was gentle, barely rocking them. But Takeda was already on his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword he was no longer wearing. He was ready to fight, to punish, to teach this insolent boatman a lesson. He peered through the mist, his eyes blazing, ready to unleash his full fury upon the person at the helm. And he saw no one. The boat was empty. A simple fishing boat, its mooring rope frayed and broken, had been caught by the current and had simply drifted into them. Takeda stood frozen, his rage fully formed but with nowhere to go. It was a wave that had risen to a great height, and now, with no shore to crash against, it had to collapse back into itself. He felt a profound and dizzying sense of foolishness. He had been shouting at the wind, at the water, at a piece of empty, drifting wood. The object of his immense anger did not exist. He slowly sat back down, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and shame. He looked at Etsudo. The old hermit was watching him, his eyes holding not judgment, but a deep and gentle compassion. "It is a difficult thing," Etsudo said softly, his voice the only sound in the misty silence, "to be angry at an empty boat." He let the words hang in the air. Takeda was silent, the truth of the experience washing over him. "You see, General," Etsudo continued, "the other boat is always empty. You were not angry at the boat. You were angry at the person you imagined was inside it. A careless, disrespectful person who was insulting you. You created him in your own mind, and then you raged at your own creation. When you saw that the boat was empty, your anger vanished, because it had lost its target. But the target was never really there. It was always in you." Takeda looked out at the empty boat, now drifting slowly away into the mist. He thought of his son, of his subordinates, of all the people at whom he had directed his rage. He had never been angry at them. He had been angry at his own idea of them, at the story his mind had created about their disrespect, their incompetence, their challenge to his self. "The world is full of empty boats," Etsudo said, his voice a gentle current. "Events happen. A sword is dropped. A shipment is late. A person says a careless word. These are like the empty boat, drifting on the currents of life, bumping into us. They have no intention, no malice. They are simply what is. But we are not content to leave them empty. We fill them with people, with intentions, with stories. We fill them with a self who is being insulted, and an other who is doing the insulting. And then we shout. We suffer. We live in a cage of our own making." He picked up the oars. "The practice is not to learn how to steer away from the other boats. That is impossible. The practice is to empty your own boat. If you can travel through the waters of life as an empty vessel, who is there to be insulted? Who is there to be angered? When another boat bumps into you, you will simply bump back, and you will both drift on." This was the beginning of Takeda's true training. He stayed with Etsudo for many months. The hermit did not teach him through lectures, but through practice. He taught Takeda to fish, to mend nets, to chop wood, to cook rice. For a great general, this was the most profound and difficult teaching of all. Every task was an assault on his ego. The voice in his head screamed, "A general does not mend nets. This is beneath me." And Etsudo would ask gently, "Who is this general? Where is he? Is he in your hands? Is he in the net? Or is he just a story, a ghost you have placed in your own boat?" Slowly, painfully, Takeda began to let the ghost go. He learned to simply be a man mending a net. He felt the rough texture of the rope, the rhythm of the work, the coolness of the evening breeze coming off the lake. He discovered that when the general was not there, the simple act of mending a net could be a deeply peaceful thing. He was emptying his boat, one story at a time. When he finally left the lake, he was a different man. His powerful presence was still there, but it was no longer a sharp, aggressive force. It was a quiet, deep stillness, like the lake itself. He returned to the capital, and his return was a test. A young, arrogant captain at the city gate, not recognizing the plainly dressed traveler, treated him with casual disrespect, blocking his path. The old Takeda would have erupted in a firestorm of rage. The man would have been stripped of his rank, if not his life. But the new Takeda simply stood there. He felt the old, familiar spark of anger begin to rise, a conditioned reflex from a lifetime of habit. But now he saw it for what it was, and in his mind he saw a small, empty boat drifting on a misty lake. He did not react. He did not shout. He did not even frown. He simply looked at the young captain, and he saw not an insult, but a young man full of his own importance, his own boat heavily laden with a new and shiny title. He saw himself. A gentle, almost imperceptible smile touched Takeda's lips. He did not pull rank. He did not assert his identity. He simply bowed, a gesture of simple, human respect, and stepped aside, allowing the young captain to pass. The captain, confused by this unexpected response from the powerful-looking stranger, hesitated for a moment, then walked on, a little less arrogantly than before. Takeda walked into the city, a free man. He had not won a battle. He had surrendered. He had surrendered the need to be right, the need to be respected, the need to defend the phantom in his boat. And in that surrender, he had found a victory more profound than any he had known on the battlefield. He had found a peace that could not be threatened, a calm that could not be broken. His boat was empty, and now he could navigate any water, in any weather, in a state of deep, unshakable, and profoundly restful peace. Takeda's return to his former life was a quiet revolution. Outwardly, he resumed his duties, but he inhabited them in a completely new way. His presence in the council chambers, once a source of tension and intimidation, became a source of calm. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a new weight, a weight not of authority, but of clarity. He no longer argued to win, but to understand. He would listen to the heated debates of the other lords, their boats crashing into one another in a storm of ego and ambition, and he would see the whole scene with a kind of compassionate detachment. He saw not enemies, but men trapped in their own full boats, shouting at phantoms. His strategic genius was not diminished, it was enhanced. Freed from the blinding glare of his own ego, he could see the battlefield with a cool, impersonal clarity. He saw the whole landscape, the flow of events, the fears and desires of his opponents, not as a personal contest, but as a great, complex pattern, like the currents on the lake. His decisions became less about crushing his enemies and more about finding the path of least resistance, the solution that brought the quickest and most lasting peace. He began to win victories not through overwhelming force, but through a wisdom that often avoided the battle altogether. His greatest triumphs were the wars that were never fought. His relationship with his son, Kenji, was the most deeply healed. One evening, not long after his return, he found his son in the library, poring over ancient scrolls. The old Takeda would have seen this as a symbol of Kenji's weakness. The new Takeda saw only a young man following his own true nature. He sat down, not as a general addressing a disappointing heir, but as a father sitting with his son. He did not speak of swords or battles. He asked Kenji about the poems he was studying. He listened, truly listened, as Kenji's face lit up, speaking of the beauty of the language, the depth of the insights. After a long while, Kenji paused and looked at his father. "You are different," he said softly. Takeda smiled. "I met an empty boat," he said. He did not need to explain further. Kenji, the scholar of subtleties, understood. He saw the peace in his father's eyes, the relaxed set of his shoulders. The cage was gone. "The greatest victory, I have learned," Takeda continued, "is not over an enemy, but over the self that creates enemies. The most profound peace is not the peace that follows a war, but the peace that exists in an empty boat, a heart that has no one to defend." This became the core of his teaching, though he never preached. He taught by example. His subordinates, who had once feared his wrath, found themselves working with a new sense of ease and creativity. They were no longer afraid to make mistakes, and so they took wiser risks. His servants, who had once walked on eggshells around him, now served him with a genuine affection. His home, which had been a fortress of tension, became a place of quiet, restful order. He never lost his strength. An empty boat is not a weak boat. In many ways, it is the strongest of all. It is light, resilient, and impossible to capsize with the winds of insult or praise. It is in perfect harmony with the water, moving with the currents, not against them. Takeda's strength was no longer the brittle strength of a clenched fist, but the supple, enduring strength of the water itself. As he grew old, he spent more and more time in his garden. He would sit for hours by the koi pond, watching the fish swim, their movements a silent, fluid calligraphy. He was not waiting for death. He was not reflecting on his past glories. He was simply present, a quiet, empty vessel in the stream of life. His mind was as calm and clear as the lake in the north. The storms of the world could still rage, but they could find no purchase on him. There was no one inside to be disturbed. And in the evenings, when he lay down to rest, sleep came to him as a welcome friend. A deep, dreamless, and profoundly peaceful merging with the great, silent emptiness from which all things arise and to which all things return. He had finally learned to sleep because he had finally learned to be no one. Part 10. Returning to the marketplace. Our journey tonight has been a long and quiet one. We began in the shadow of wanting, feeling the weight of a cup that was too full. We chased echoes in a lonely valley, and then, in our exhaustion, we found the first profound stillness. We learned to flow like a river, to find the tracks of our own true nature in the mud of our ordinary lives. We found a deep relaxation in the beauty of our own imperfections, like a cracked pot that waters a garden of flowers. We learned to see the entire moon in a single drop of dew, and finally, we found the ultimate freedom in letting go of the phantom in our boat, learning to travel the waters of life as an empty vessel. And so, we arrive at the final stage of the path. What happens after the boat is empty? What happens after the ox has been found and tamed and the herder has returned home? Does he remain in a state of solitary bliss on a mountaintop, forever separate from the world? The deepest wisdom of the way says no. The journey is not complete until the circle is closed. The final step is not away from the world, but back into its very heart. It is the return to the marketplace, a return not of a seeker, but of one who has found that what he was seeking was never lost. This is the final, most gentle story, the one that carries us from deep relaxation into a state of peaceful, contented sleep. There was a man who had spent many years in the mountains. Some said he had been a monk, others a hermit. No one in the bustling city below knew his name or his story. They only knew that one day he appeared. He did not arrive with any fanfare. He simply walked into the city's great marketplace, a place of 1,000 noises, 1,000 smells, 1,000 desires. The marketplace was the world in miniature. It was a chaotic, vibrant, and often painful dance of life. Fishmongers shouted their prices, their voices hoarse, the air around them thick with the sharp, salty smell of the sea. Silk merchants argued with weavers over the price of a single thread. Children cried, beggars pleaded, and fortune-tellers promised futures that were always just out of reach. It was a place of endless chasing, a great, swirling vortex of full cups and heavily laden boats, all crashing into one another. The man from the mountains entered this scene like a drop of clear water falling into a vat of muddy dye. He was old, but his age was impossible to guess. His face was calm, his eyes held a deep, quiet amusement, and he walked with the slow, unhurried gait of someone with nowhere to go and nothing to do. He was barefoot, and his simple robe was clean but patched in several places. He carried nothing but a large, empty cloth sack slung over his shoulder. In a place where everyone was either buying or selling, he seemed to have no purpose at all. He was not separate from the chaos. He did not float above it with an air of spiritual superiority. He waded right into the thick of it. He smiled at the shouting merchants. He nodded to the haggling women. He seemed to take a genuine, simple delight in the whole, messy, beautiful, and heartbreaking spectacle of human life. He stopped at a stall where two brothers, both vegetable sellers, were in the midst of a furious argument. Their faces were red, their voices sharp with anger. A basket of cabbages had been overturned, and they were blaming each other, their words like stones. The man from the mountains simply stood nearby, looking at their remaining vegetables with a gentle curiosity. He picked up a radish, its skin a perfect, deep crimson. He held it in his palm, feeling its coolness, its weight. He did not say a word to the brothers. He did not intervene or offer any wisdom. He simply stood there, his presence a small, quiet pool of stillness in their storm of anger. One of the brothers, noticing him, paused his shouting. "What do you want, old man?" he snapped, his anger looking for a new target. The man from the mountains smiled. "This is a beautiful radish," he said, his voice quiet and calm. "How much for this one?" His simple, unanxious presence had a strange effect. The brother looked from the old man's calm face to his brother's angry one, and suddenly the fury of their argument seemed ridiculous, a great fire over a very small piece of wood. The energy of the fight simply dissipated, like smoke in the wind. "Take it," the brother grumbled, his anger now replaced by a sheepish embarrassment. "It's a gift." The old man bowed his head in thanks, placed the radish in his empty sack, and walked on. The two brothers stood in silence for a moment. Then one of them bent down and began to pick up the fallen cabbages. The other joined him. The argument was over, and neither of them knew why. The man from the mountains continued his slow, aimless walk. He saw a young mother scolding her small daughter, who was crying because she had dropped her honey cake in the dust. The mother was tired and frustrated, her voice sharp. The child's world had collapsed into a single, tragic moment of loss. The man knelt down. He did not offer to buy a new cake. He did not speak words of comfort. He simply pointed to a line of ants that was already beginning to investigate the fallen sweet. "Look," he whispered, a note of genuine wonder in his voice. "A feast." The little girl's crying stopped, her sobs turning into hiccups of curiosity. She watched, fascinated, as the tiny ants worked together, exploring this great golden mountain that had fallen from their sky. The mother watched too, and the tension in her face softened. She saw not a mess to be cleaned up, but a small, intricate drama of nature. She placed a gentle hand on her daughter's head, her frustration forgotten, replaced by a shared moment of simple, quiet observation. The man from the mountains smiled, stood up, and moved on, leaving behind him a small pocket of peace. This was his way. He was not a teacher who gave sermons. He was not a saint who performed miracles. His gift was far more subtle. He was like a tuning fork. His own being was so perfectly in tune with the deep, quiet harmony of existence that his mere presence helped others to find that same note within themselves, if only for a moment. He did not add anything to the world. He simply, by his own emptiness, allowed the world to remember its own inherent peace. Later in the day, he wandered into a part of the market where the laborers and porters gathered after their hard day's work. It was a rough, noisy place. Men with calloused hands and aching backs sat drinking cheap wine, their laughter loud, their talk full of boasts and complaints. A holy man would have avoided this place, seeing it as impure, a place of indulgence and ignorance. The man from the mountains walked right in and sat down on an empty crate among them. They looked at him, suspicious at first, but there was no judgment in his eyes, no sense that he was better than them. He was just an old man, resting his feet. One of the men, his tongue loosened by the wine, offered him a cup. The man accepted it with a nod of thanks. He did not drink to get drunk. He drank to share a moment of communion. He listened as the men told their stories of hard work, of small joys, of deep sorrows. He did not offer advice. He did not preach about the virtues of sobriety or the dangers of attachment. He simply listened, and his listening was a profound gift. It was a vast, empty space in which these men, for the first time, felt truly heard, without judgment. In his quiet, accepting presence, their loud boasts softened into honest confessions of their fears. Their bitter complaints eased into a shared understanding of their difficult lives. They did not become enlightened, but for a little while, in the company of this strange, peaceful old man, their burdens felt a little lighter. They touched a place of quiet dignity within themselves that the wine could not reach. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the emptying marketplace, the man from the mountains stood up. His sack was no longer empty. It contained a single radish, a bruised apple given to him by a grateful fruit seller, and a handful of wilted greens that someone had been about to throw away. He had bought nothing, and he had sold nothing, but he had shared in the life of the world. He walked towards the city gates, his bare feet silent on the cooling stones. He had not come to the marketplace to save anyone. He had not come to teach a great doctrine. He had come because he was a part of it all. The peace he had found in the mountains was not a fragile treasure to be hoarded in solitude. It was a boundless, inexhaustible spring. The more he gave of it, the more it flowed. He was, as the old masters said, like a withered tree that inexplicably puts forth new blossoms. He did not try to bloom, he simply bloomed. His compassion was not an act of will, it was the natural fragrance of his own emptiness. And this is the final, gentle truth for us to rest in tonight. The journey does not end with our escape from the world, it ends with our peaceful return. The marketplace is not a place to be feared or transcended. It is our home. Our jobs, our families, our joys and our sorrows, this is the marketplace of our lives. The goal is not to leave it behind, but to learn to walk through it with an empty boat and a quiet heart. True happiness is not a destination. It is not a prize to be won and then guarded. It is a way of being in the world. It is the peace that comes when we stop chasing, when we stop striving, when we stop trying to be anyone special. It is the simple, profound contentment of returning to the marketplace of our own life, ready to offer our own quiet presence to its beautiful, messy, and sacred dance. And so now, you can rest. There is nowhere else to go. There is nothing else to achieve. The chasing is over. The boat is empty. You are already home. Let the sounds of the world, the sounds of your own marketplace, become a lullaby. Let go of the day. Let go of the self that has carried it, and sink into the deep, quiet, and boundless peace that has been here all along, waiting for you, right in the heart of your own ordinary, beautiful life.